They were the silent shadow of Nazi Germany, the enforcers of fear, a secret police force whose very name still sends chills through history, the Gestapo. Born in the early years of Hitler's dictatorship, they were not an ordinary police agency, but an organization designed to root out enemies, both real and imagined, tightening the noose of totalitarian control around every citizen of the Reich. With no need for warrants, no obligation to courts, and no hesitation in the use of intimidation, torture, and terror, the Gestapo became the ultimate weapon of internal suppression. Their presence was everywhere and nowhere, whispered about in cafes, feared in workplaces, and dreaded at the door in the dead of night. What made them so terrifying was not their numbers but their reach. For in reality, the Gestapo was a relatively small organization, yet through a vast network of informants, collaborators, and ordinary citizens willing to betray neighbors, their influence grew to dominate every corner of life. A careless remark, a whispered joke, or a misplaced letter could be enough to bring the dreaded knock at the door. From Berlin to Vienna, from Warsaw to Paris, the Gestapo became the invisible hand of oppression, feeding the machinery of concentration camps and fueling the Nazi war state with fear and obedience. But beyond their role as domestic enforcers, the Gestapo expanded into occupied Europe, where their methods grew even darker. They hunted resistance fighters, rounded up Jews for deportation, and interrogated with merciless precision. In France, Norway, and the Netherlands, they became the most hated face of Nazi rule. And yet, they were not faceless bureaucrats alone. They were men, Heinrich Müller, Reinhard Heydrich, Adolf Eichmann, who combined ruthless efficiency with ideological fanaticism, ensuring that the Gestapo became not only an arm of power, but a central cog in the machinery of genocide. Tonight we uncover the entire story of Hitler's secret police, their origins, their methods, their victims, and their eventual fall. We will trace their rise from a tool of political repression to the feared architects of wartime terror, and we will hear the voices of those who lived in their shadow. So wherever you are tuning in from, be it late night in London, the quiet hours in Toronto, or early morning in New Delhi, stay with us as we unravel the entire history of the Gestapo, the secret police who turned a nation into a prison and left behind one of the darkest legacies of the Second World War. In 1918, the guns of the First World War fell silent, but Germany did not find peace. Instead, it stumbled into chaos, a nation defeated, humiliated, and on the brink of collapse. The Versailles Treaty stripped away territory, dismantled the army, and imposed reparations that shattered the economy. Cities boiled with unrest as returning soldiers, unemployed and embittered, marched alongside workers demanding change. The fear of communist revolution haunted Germany, especially after the Russian Bolsheviks had seized power in 1917. Uprisings in Berlin, Munich, and the Ruhr Valley seemed to confirm that Germany too might fall to the red tide. The fledgling Weimar Republic, fragile and unpopular, leaned heavily on its police to restore order. Policing became not just a tool of law, but a weapon of political survival. The seeds of authoritarian control were planted in the soil of desperation. Out of this turmoil, the conditions for the Gestapo were quietly taking shape. The Weimar police inherited traditions from Imperial Germany, traditions steeped in hierarchy and obedience. Prussian police in particular had long served as instruments of state authority rather than protectors of the people. They were heavily militarized, trained to suppress unrest with force, and culturally inclined to see political dissent as criminal. This orientation made them effective against street protests, but ill-prepared for democratic governance. Instead of adjusting to the new republic, many officers remained loyal to conservative ideals, and skeptical of parliamentary rule. Their hostility to the left, and especially to communists, made them natural allies of reactionary forces. While they could be ruthless in quelling workers' uprisings, they were often lenient toward right-wing militias. This imbalance would prove fatal to the credibility of Weimar democracy. The police were meant to be neutral arbiters, but they became guardians of a fragile order leaning toward repression. Their institutional DNA predisposed them to authoritarianism. Germany in the early 1920s was plagued by political violence, and the police stood at its center. Clashes between communist Red Front fighters and right-wing Freikorps units turned city streets into battlegrounds. Demonstrations ended in bloodshed, assassinations destabilized politics, and paramilitary marches flaunted the weakness of the state. The police were tasked with controlling this storm, but their loyalties often dictated whom they fought harder. When communists rioted, police cracked down with rifles and batons. When right-wing mobs threatened, responses were slower, more cautious, sometimes sympathetic. This unequal treatment alienated large swaths of the working class, feeding resentment and mistrust. It also emboldened the radical right, who recognized that the state's enforcers were not their enemies. The stage was being set for the emergence of movements that would weaponize violence more systematically. The Gestapo would later inherit this precedent, policing as an instrument of political bias. What was sown in Weimar would be reaped by the Reich. The rise of paramilitary organizations further destabilized the fragile republic. The Freikorps, made up of disillusioned veterans, patrolled cities and suppressed communist uprisings with ferocity. Their violence was both tolerated and encouraged by government authorities desperate for order. Out of these bands grew traditions of extra-legal enforcement and political vigilantism. In the early 1920s, another movement was rising in Bavaria, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, with its own stormtroopers, the SA. These brown-shirted militias staged rallies, intimidated opponents, and fought street battles that eroded the line between politics and violence. The police, overstretched and inconsistent, often looked the other way, especially when right-wing paramilitaries targeted communists. This created a culture where brute force was accepted as a legitimate form of political expression. Violence became normalized as part of Germany's civic life. The Nazis learned from this landscape, refining it into something far more dangerous. By the late 1920s, the German police had grown increasingly reliant on surveillance and informants to control dissent. Files multiplied, detailing the activities of political groups, trade unions, and journalists deemed subversive. Political policing became a profession, with dedicated departments monitoring enemies of the state. Yet the scope of this surveillance far exceeded the resources available, giving the illusion of omniscience without the reality of control. This reliance on informants created a culture of suspicion, turning neighbors into spies and sowing mistrust within communities. These methods would later be perfected by the Gestapo, who mastered the art of turning ordinary citizens into agents of fear. But in the Weimar years, such policing often appeared clumsy, inconsistent, and limited by law. Courts sometimes struck down overreach, defending civil liberties in principle, even as they were eroded in practice. The tension between legality and necessity wore down democratic safeguards. The foundations of dictatorship were being laid under the cover of legality. The economic collapse of the early 1930s turned this fragile system into a breeding ground for extremism. The Great Depression devastated Germany, throwing millions into unemployment and despair. The police were once again called upon to maintain order in a country unraveling at the seams. Hunger marches, strikes, and mass protests filled the streets, and clashes with police turned increasingly violent. Radical parties gained traction, offering promises of salvation through force and ideology. The Nazis, in particular, capitalized on the fear of chaos, presenting themselves as the only bulwark against communism. Their SA stormtroopers grew in numbers, clashing daily with opponents in spectacles of violence that the police could not control. In many cities, the police relied on cooperation with right-wing militias to keep communists at bay. This convergence of interests blurred the line between the state and the Nazis. The Gestapo would later emerge from this very nexus of fear, violence, and political convenience. The Nazis understood the weaknesses of the Weimar police better than anyone. They saw an institution predisposed to authoritarianism, already used to suppressing the left, and hungry for stability in a sea of chaos. Once in power, Hitler and his lieutenants would not need to dismantle this system. They only needed to redirect it. The police tradition of surveillance, repression, and political bias provided the perfect framework for dictatorship. The Gestapo, when created, would appear new, but it was built on old habits. Informants, intimidation, and bureaucracy were already part of German policing culture. What the Nazis added was total ideological commitment and absolute freedom from legal restraint. In this way, Weimar's vulnerabilities became the Reich's weapons. The soil of democracy had nourished the roots of dictatorship. The Gestapo's birth was foreshadowed long before 1933. Thus, the seeds of terror were planted well before the Gestapo came into being. Weimar Germany's political policing, its reliance on surveillance, its uneven enforcement of law, and its tolerance of right-wing violence created a blueprint for authoritarian control. The Nazis did not invent political policing. They perfected it. They took a fractured system and transformed it into a tool of absolute power. The chaos after World War I had conditioned Germans to accept strong policing as the price of stability. By the time Hitler rose to power, the people had already lived with a culture of repression and fear. The Gestapo would take these tendencies to terrifying extremes, elevating suspicion, denunciation, and terror into instruments of governance. But its origins remain rooted in the instability of the 1920s and the failures of the Weimar Republic. Before there was a Gestapo, there was already a Germany primed for its arrival. The terror to come was born in the chaos of defeat. The year 1933 was a turning point not only for Germany, but for the entire world. Adolf Hitler, appointed Chancellor in January, wasted no time in consolidating power. Within weeks, the Reichstag fire provided the pretext for emergency decrees that stripped away civil liberties. Freedom of speech, assembly, and press were abolished overnight, creating a legal framework for dictatorship. In this environment of fear and upheaval, the foundations of the Gestapo were laid. Hermann Göring, the ambitious Nazi who had secured control of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior, saw policing as the key to securing the new regime. Prussia was the largest and most influential German state, and whoever controlled its police controlled Germany's political heart. Göring's strategy was simple: transform the existing police into an arm of the Nazi Party. He needed an organization not bound by law, but devoted entirely to crushing enemies. Out of this vision, the Gestapo was born. Göring began by purging the Prussian police of men loyal to democracy. Senior officers who had resisted Nazi intimidation were dismissed, retired, or replaced with party loyalists. Conservative bureaucrats who had once tolerated the Republic but now sought stability often welcomed Nazi appointments, believing they would restore order. At the same time, Göring flooded the police with SA and SS men, bringing street-level brutality into official uniform. The old culture of impartiality, already weak, was destroyed in weeks. What remained was a police force increasingly indistinguishable from Nazi militias. Out of this hybrid structure emerged a new unit dedicated exclusively to political policing. On April 26, 1933, Goering formally announced the creation of the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Secret State Police, or Gestapo. Its task was clear: identify, hunt, and destroy all enemies of the Nazi regime. Its methods would soon terrify an entire nation. The Gestapo's earliest mission was the elimination of political opposition. Communists, socialists, and trade union leaders were among the first targets. Police files that had existed since Weimar were immediately handed over, providing lists of names, addresses, and affiliations. Raids were carried out in the dead of night, with suspects dragged from their homes and subjected to brutal interrogations. Concentration camps, beginning with the newly established Dachau, became the destinations for these political prisoners. The Gestapo's efficiency was enhanced by fear. Many Germans denounced neighbors, co-workers, or even family members to demonstrate loyalty to the new order. By mid-1933, opposition parties were outlawed, and their leaders either silenced, imprisoned, or driven into exile. The speed with which the Gestapo dismantled organized resistance stunned even its own officers. Germany's political landscape was cleared in a matter of months. Terror, not persuasion, cemented Nazi rule. The Gestapo was unique in that it operated outside the constraints of normal law. Goering granted his new force the right to act without judicial oversight, bypassing courts and traditional police procedures. Arrests required no warrants, and prisoners had no right to appeal. This principle, later known as Schutzhaft, protective custody, was a euphemism for indefinite detention without trial. By removing legal restraint, Goering created a police force accountable only to the regime. Bureaucrats who once managed paperwork now wielded unchecked power over life and liberty. The Nazi state thus institutionalized lawlessness, cloaking it in administrative routine. Forms, files, and signatures gave an appearance of order, but beneath the paperwork lay terror. This transformation was radical. The Gestapo was not just a police unit, but an entirely new instrument of dictatorship. It represented the death of rule of law in Germany. Control of Prussia's police gave Goering enormous influence, but his ambitions reached further. He envisioned the Gestapo as a model for all of Germany, a tool that could extend Nazi control beyond Prussia. Yet Goering faced rivals, including Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, who were building their own power bases within the SS. For the moment, however, Goering's dominance in Prussia allowed him to experiment freely. He expanded the Gestapo's bureaucracy, recruiting not only party zealots, but professional detectives who valued efficiency above ideology. These men adapted quickly, discovering that career advancement now depended on loyalty to the regime. They became cogs in a machine that rewarded obedience and punished hesitation. Bureaucratic ambition fused seamlessly with political terror. The Gestapo was thus both revolutionary and traditional, combining modern paperwork with medieval cruelty. Its influence grew daily, spreading beyond Prussia into the Reich at large. The Gestapo's rise was supported by Nazi propaganda, which portrayed it as omniscient and omnipresent. Newspapers exaggerated its power, insisting that no act of dissent could escape its gaze. This cultivated an atmosphere where people assumed surveillance was constant, even when resources were limited. Fear became self-sustaining, as Germans policed themselves and denounced others preemptively. In reality, the Gestapo was relatively small in its early years, numbering only a few thousand agents. Yet its reputation magnified its reach, making it appear all-knowing and unstoppable. Goering understood that perception was as important as reality. The myth of the all-seeing Gestapo became one of the most effective weapons in Nazi Germany. It was terror through suggestion as much as through action. The people came to believe resistance was impossible. The year 1933 was therefore decisive not only for Hitler's consolidation of power, but also for the birth of a police state. With the Gestapo at its core, repression became systemic rather than sporadic. Violence was no longer limited to street battles or vigilante attacks. It was bureaucratized, legalized, and embedded into the machinery of government. The line between party and state was erased as the Gestapo merged ideology with official authority. What began in Prussia soon spread to other German states, as similar secret police units were created or absorbed. Within 2 years, Himmler and Heydrich would wrest control of the Gestapo from Göring, folding it into the SS empire. But the foundation had been laid in 1933 under Göring's watchful eye. The fusion of legality, terror, and bureaucracy defined its character from the start. The Gestapo was the child of dictatorship's first year. It would grow into its most feared weapon. Looking back, the creation of the Gestapo in 1933 appears almost inevitable, yet it was the product of deliberate choices. Göring exploited the chaos of Hitler's early months in power to carve out a domain that merged policing with party ideology. He built on traditions of political surveillance inherited from Weimar, but stripped away the constraints of law. He institutionalized fear, transforming neighbors into informants and police into executioners of ideology. This was not an organic evolution, but a calculated revolution in governance. The Gestapo's founding year marked the death of dissent in Germany and the beginning of a reign of terror unparalleled in modern Europe. In its offices, paperwork would become as deadly as pistols and signatures as lethal as bullets. 1933 was the year ordinary policing died and political policing was reborn. The Nazi state had its secret weapon, and Germany had entered an age of silence. The Gestapo had taken root, and fear began to bloom. Hermann Göring may have created the Gestapo, but he would not control it for long. In the ruthless hierarchy of the Third Reich, power was constantly contested, and rivals sought every opportunity to expand their domains. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, recognized that secret policing was essential to his vision of an all-encompassing state within a state. He saw the Gestapo not as Göring's toy, but as the natural instrument of SS domination. Standing at Himmler's side was Reinhard Heydrich, a man as brilliant as he was merciless. Together, they maneuvered with patience and cunning, determined to wrest the Gestapo away from Göring and fuse it with their expanding empire of terror. The struggle for control was not fought with open confrontation, but with quiet bureaucratic warfare, persuasion, and strategic alliances. Hitler, always eager to see his subordinates compete, allowed the rivalry to play out. By 1934, the balance of power was shifting rapidly. The Gestapo was moving toward the iron grip of Himmler and Heydrich. Heinrich Himmler was not a soldier in the traditional sense, nor a man of charisma, but he possessed a fanatical devotion to Nazi ideology and an extraordinary organizational mind. He envisioned the SS as more than a paramilitary force. It was to be the racial elite, the guardians of the regime's future. For this vision to succeed, the SS needed total control over surveillance, repression, and intelligence. Himmler understood that policing was not merely about crime, but about shaping society itself. In this, he was unlike Göring, whose interest in the Gestapo was more pragmatic and opportunistic. Himmler's ambitions were ideological, rooted in the belief that only absolute control could secure Nazi racial destiny. With Heydrich as his strategist, he pursued the Gestapo with relentless focus. The police would no longer be a branch of the state, but a weapon of the SS. It was a chilling transformation from political convenience to ideological mission. Reinhard Heydrich, the so-called blonde beast, was the perfect counterpart to Himmler's vision. Where Himmler was plodding and bureaucratic, Heydrich was sharp, quick, and ruthless. A former naval officer disgraced by scandal, he had been plucked from obscurity by Himmler and quickly demonstrated his brilliance in intelligence and organization. Heydrich created the Sicherheitsdienst SD, the SS intelligence service, which soon became the Gestapo's twin and rival. He saw in the Gestapo not only a police force, but the nucleus of an all-seeing apparatus of control. Under his influence, files multiplied, informant networks expanded, and every act of dissent was catalogued with chilling efficiency. Heydrich thrived in the shadows, building webs of surveillance that reached into every corner of German life. To him, repression was not a blunt instrument, but a precise tool. The Gestapo, under his guidance, would become the scalpel of Nazi terror. Together with Himmler, Heydrich turned ambition into machinery. The decisive moment came in April 1934, when Goering, under pressure from Hitler, agreed to transfer control of the Gestapo to Himmler. Goering focused on building the Luftwaffe and maintaining his position as Hitler's economic strongman, no longer had the energy to fight for the Gestapo. Himmler, by contrast, saw this as the keystone in his empire. Once the transfer was complete, the Gestapo ceased to be merely a Prussian creation. It became part of the SS's rapidly growing state within a state. Heydrich was appointed chief of the Gestapo, ensuring that his vision of intelligence-driven repression would dominate its operations. This shift marked the true birth of the Gestapo as we remember it, not a police unit, but the core of a vast system of surveillance and terror. Goering's experiment had been consumed by the SS Leviathan. Himmler and Heydrich were now the architects of fear. With the Gestapo in their hands, Himmler and Heydrich moved quickly to consolidate their power. They merged the Gestapo with the SS intelligence service, creating a seamless apparatus that blurred the lines between police and spies. Every act of dissent, from political opposition to whispered criticism, was now within their jurisdiction. They professionalized the bureaucracy, creating standardized procedures for surveillance, interrogation, and detention. At the same time, they encouraged an aura of mystery and omnipotence, exaggerating the Gestapo's size and reach. In reality, the force remained relatively small, but it was magnified by propaganda and the voluntary denunciations of ordinary Germans. Fear was their greatest resource, and they wielded it with surgical precision. Under Himmler and Heydrich, the Gestapo became less about brute force and more about total control. They aimed not just to punish dissent, but to anticipate it. The police state was no longer a dream, it was being built in real time. The Night of the Long Knives in June 1934 demonstrated the Gestapo's new role under SS leadership. When Hitler ordered the purge of the SA and other rivals, it was the Gestapo and SS that carried out arrests, interrogations, and executions. The operation was swift, ruthless, and efficient, proving the value of a secret police controlled by ideologues rather than pragmatists. In the purge's aftermath, the Gestapo emerged as the regime's indispensable weapon. Hitler rewarded Himmler and Heydrich with expanded authority, formally recognizing their control over political policing across Germany. The SS had achieved its goal. The Gestapo was no longer a Prussian experiment, but a national institution. This consolidation marked a new stage in the Nazi state's development. Dissent had not only been crushed, it had been eradicated from the public sphere. The terror apparatus had shown its teeth, and the German people understood its message. The age of silence deepened. Himmler and Heydrich were not content with merely inheriting the Gestapo. they redefined its purpose. They envisioned a police force that was not reactive but proactive, capable of shaping society according to Nazi ideology. Political opposition was only the beginning. Soon the Gestapo turned its gaze to cultural conformity, racial purity, and the elimination of social elements. Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, and other minorities became new targets, expanding the Gestapo's mandate beyond politics into the realm of morality. Every arrest reinforced the idea that the regime controlled not only public behavior, but private life. By embedding ideology into policing, Himmler and Heydrich ensured that terror penetrated every corner of German society. The Gestapo was no longer about silencing enemies, it was about creating a new society. Its power lay not only in what it did, but in what people feared it might do. Fear became the currency of the state, and Himmler and Heydrich minted it daily. By the mid-1930s, the Gestapo under Himmler and Heydrich had become the backbone of the Nazi police state. Its roots lay in Goering's opportunism, but its growth was driven by SS ambition and ideology. Himmler supplied the vision of a totalitarian order, and Heydrich provided the ruthless efficiency to build it. Together, they transformed a regional police force into a national instrument of repression, surveillance, and fear. Their consolidation of power represented more than an administrative shift. It was the creation of a new kind of state, a state where law was replaced by decree, where justice was replaced by ideology, and where security was replaced by terror. The Gestapo became the watchful eye of the Reich, invisible yet omnipresent, weak in numbers yet infinite in perception. It was the perfect instrument for a dictatorship that demanded absolute conformity. Himmler and Heydrich had built more than a police force. They had built the architecture of fear, and that architecture would endure until the Reich collapsed in ruins. The Gestapo's true power did not rest in vast armies of agents, but in its ability to make ordinary people part of its machinery. From the very beginning, Himmler and Heydrich recognized that Germany could not be controlled by force alone. Instead, they created a system where surveillance was woven into the fabric of daily life. Every neighborhood, every workplace, every school became a potential site of scrutiny. Citizens were encouraged, sometimes coerced, to denounce their neighbors, co-workers, and even family members for any sign of disloyalty. What began as isolated reports grew into an avalanche of accusations, filling Gestapo offices with files and folders. The German people themselves became the eyes and ears of the dictatorship, ensuring that silence and conformity spread faster than resistance. The act of speaking freely became dangerous because one never knew who was listening. In this way, terror became not just vertical, imposed from above, but horizontal, generated among the people themselves. Denunciations flowed into Gestapo headquarters at an astonishing rate. Letters were written anonymously, telephone calls were made secretly, and whispered reports reached local offices daily. Some denunciations were motivated by genuine loyalty to the regime, others by fear, and many by personal grudges or petty rivalries. A jealous neighbor, a disgruntled colleague, or a resentful spouse could transform suspicion into persecution with a single report. The Gestapo welcomed this flood of information not only because it identified potential enemies, but because it reinforced the culture of fear. Everyone knew that being overheard could mean interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. The result was a society where trust disintegrated, and even private life was penetrated by state terror. Denunciation became both weapon and shield, an act that could harm others or protect oneself. For the Gestapo, this willingness of Germans to police each other was a priceless resource. Fear spread faster than their agents ever could. Behind the scenes, the Gestapo was a bureaucracy as much as a secret police. Its officers maintained meticulous files on suspects, compiling biographical details, reports, and interrogation notes. Each case was documented in dense, formal language, creating an illusion of legality and professionalism. Yet these documents often contained little more than rumor, gossip, or personal vendetta, elevated to the level of official truth by the stamp of the state. Filing cabinets expanded, corridors filled with folders, and paper became as dangerous as bullets. The sheer weight of documentation gave the Gestapo a sense of omniscience, as if every German life could be reduced to a dossier. Bureaucrats, some trained in law, others in administration, processed these files with chilling detachment. To them, lives were not stories, but entries in a registry of loyalty and treachery. The paperwork concealed the brutality behind it, masking torture and imprisonment with the language of procedure. This was terror disguised as administration. The Gestapo's organization reflected this bureaucratic obsession. Local offices reported to regional centers, which in turn reported to the central headquarters in Berlin. Each level maintained strict procedures for forwarding denunciations, conducting investigations, and filing results. This pyramid of information gave the Gestapo the appearance of efficiency, though in reality it was riddled with delays, contradictions, and human error. What made the system effective was not perfection, but perception. To the ordinary German, the Gestapo seemed everywhere because its files seemed endless and its decisions unquestionable. Even when officers lacked resources, the aura of their paperwork and authority made them untouchable. A knock on the door, a summons to an office, a name appearing in a file, these were enough to inspire obedience. The Gestapo became omnipotent, not because it was flawless, but because it was believed to be flawless. In terror, belief was as powerful as fact. The myth of omnipotence was carefully cultivated by Himmler and Heydrich. Propaganda emphasized the Gestapo's all-seeing eye, suggesting that no secret was safe and no whisper went unheard. Films, newspapers, and Nazi speeches presented the secret police as a superhuman force of vigilance. Stories circulated of enemies unmasked and traitors caught, reinforcing the idea that resistance was futile. In reality, the Gestapo had relatively few agents, fewer than many modern police departments in democratic states. But it did not matter. What mattered was that Germans believed the Gestapo knew everything. Fear made people censor themselves, isolate from suspicious company, and denounce others before they themselves could be denounced. The Gestapo's strength lay in this psychological manipulation. The regime had created a society that spied on itself. Terror no longer needed to be enforced in every corner, it was internalized. Examples from daily life reveal the frightening reach of this machinery. A joke about Hitler in a workplace, overheard and reported, could end in arrest. A foreign radio broadcast played too loudly could bring interrogation. Even private conversations at family dinners were sometimes betrayed, as children repeated their parents' words to teachers trained to report suspicious remarks. In such an environment, no space was safe. Germans learned to weigh every word, to choose silence over speech, conformity over honesty. The Gestapo thrived not on catching conspiracies, but on destroying trust between individuals. Its files were filled less with genuine plots than with everyday gossip, elevated to the status of treason. Ordinary Germans, acting out of fear or malice, became participants in their own repression. This self-surveillance was perhaps the Gestapo's greatest achievement. It turned a nation into its accomplice, and it ensured that resistance withered before it could grow. Yet, behind the mask of omnipotence, the Gestapo was surprisingly limited. It lacked the manpower to monitor every household, every street, or every factory. Instead, it relied on the web of denunciations and the perception of all-seeing power. Most investigations began not from professional detection, but from civilian reports. In this sense, the Gestapo's true genius was its ability to weaponize society itself. The myth of omniscience was sustained not by surveillance cameras or massive data systems, but by ordinary people betraying one another. This reliance on the public exposed both the strength and fragility of the system. It could crush individuals with terrifying speed, but it was often blind to real threats until they were reported. Still, the effect was devastating. The Gestapo needed no army of watchers because fear had turned every German into one. By the mid-1930s, the machinery of surveillance was fully in place. The Gestapo was not just a secret police. It was the architect of a society where trust was impossible and fear was constant. Its files, its denunciations, its bureaucracy created the illusion of omnipresence, an illusion that was as effective as reality. Germans lived under the shadow of an all-seeing state, even when the state's eyes were few. The result was silence, a nation that outwardly conformed, inwardly trembled, and rarely dared to resist. Himmler and Heydrich had succeeded in creating a police state, not through numbers but through psychology. They had built a machine where perception was as deadly as fact. This was the Gestapo's greatest weapon, the myth of omnipotence, and it would sustain the regime for over a decade, crushing dissent before it could even find a voice. In Nazi Germany, silence itself became the sound of fear. The first and most immediate task of the Gestapo was the destruction of Germany's political opposition. In 1933, the Nazis faced formidable adversaries: the Communist Party of Germany (KPD), the Social Democratic Party (SPD), and powerful trade unions that had defended the Republic. These organizations represented millions of workers, activists, and intellectuals who despised Hitler's dictatorship. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 provided the pretext to act, with communists immediately accused of plotting revolution. Within hours, police and SA units stormed communist offices, seized printing presses, and arrested leaders en masse. The Reichstag fire decree suspended civil liberties, granting the Gestapo unlimited authority to silence dissent. In the following weeks, tens of thousands of communists and socialists were rounded up, often with brutal violence. The SPD, long Germany's strongest democratic party, was banned by June, its leadership either imprisoned or forced into exile. Trade unions, vital to working-class solidarity, were dismantled in a single coordinated blow on May Day 1933. Within months, political pluralism in Germany was eradicated by terror and police repression. Communists bore the brunt of the Gestapo's fury, as they were portrayed as the greatest threat to Nazi power. Gestapo officers raided safe houses, infiltrated underground cells, and tortured captured activists for information. Resistance newspapers and leaflets were seized, their writers brutally interrogated. Suspected communists were often paraded through the streets, humiliated and beaten before being dragged to makeshift prisons. For the regime, it was not enough to silence leaders. Entire networks had to be obliterated. The Gestapo learned quickly to exploit fear, turning captured activists into informants against their comrades. Families of communists were harassed, jobs were lost, and children were stigmatized. Socialists, too, faced relentless persecution, as their long history of opposition to authoritarianism made them prime targets. SPD leaders fled abroad, forming exile groups in Prague, Paris, and later London, but their ability to influence events inside Germany dwindled rapidly. By 1934, the communist and socialist underground was shattered, its survivors scattered in exile, prison or concentration camps. The Gestapo had demonstrated the ruthless efficiency with which it could dismantle organized opposition. Trade unions, once a powerful counterweight to authoritarian rule, were destroyed with surgical precision. On May 2, 1933, in a coordinated strike known as the Gleichschaltung of labor, Gestapo units, SA stormtroopers, and Nazi officials seized union offices across Germany. Union leaders were arrested, their assets confiscated, and their organizations dissolved overnight. In their place, the Nazis created the German Labor Front Deutsche Arbeitsfront, a regime-controlled body that stripped workers of independent representation. Workers lost the right to strike, bargain collectively, or organize freely. Instead, they were subjected to Nazi propaganda and forced participation in strength through joy programs designed to pacify them. The Gestapo closely monitored workplaces to prevent dissent, punishing even small acts of defiance as sabotage. Dismissals, blacklisting, and imprisonment awaited those who resisted. The destruction of unions eliminated one of the last bastions of democratic resistance. It also demonstrated the Gestapo's role not just in policing ideology, but in reshaping German society itself. Through terror, the labor movement was broken, and workers were bound to the Nazi state. Early political prisoners faced grim fates in the hands of the Gestapo. Makeshift detention centers were established in basements, prisons, and abandoned buildings where opponents were interrogated, beaten, and often killed. These improvised prisons soon gave way to the formal system of concentration camps. Dachau, established in March 1933 near Munich, became the prototype, housing thousands of communists, socialists, trade unionists, and other dissidents. Run initially by the SA and later by the SS, Dachau embodied the merger of police repression and ideological punishment. Prisoners were subjected to brutal conditions, forced labor, inadequate food, and constant beatings. Gestapo officers routinely transferred prisoners to Dachau without trial, using the legal fiction of protective custody. The term masked the reality of indefinite imprisonment in conditions designed to break body and spirit. Families were often not informed of their loved ones' whereabouts, and letters were censored or fabricated. The terror of disappearance became as powerful as the knock on the door itself. For Germany's political opponents, imprisonment was often a death sentence in slow motion. The expansion of concentration camps was directly linked to the Gestapo's need to process the growing numbers of political prisoners. By 1934, Dachau was joined by camps in Oranienburg, Esterwagen, and other locations, each serving as a dumping ground for the regime's enemies. The Gestapo coordinated arrests, interrogations, and transfers, ensuring a steady flow of prisoners to these facilities. Conditions inside the camps were deliberately dehumanizing. Prisoners were forced into exhausting labor, starved, beaten, and subjected to arbitrary punishments. The camps served a dual purpose, neutralizing opposition and terrifying the wider population into submission. Word of their horrors spread quickly, often exaggerated, but always effective in sowing fear. For those outside, the mere possibility of being sent to a camp silenced dissent before it began. By institutionalizing repression in camps, the Gestapo created a permanent system of control. Political prisoners became the first victims of a machinery that would later devour millions. The roots of genocide lay in the soil of political repression. Interrogation was one of the Gestapo's most feared tools, and political prisoners were among its earliest victims. Suspects were dragged into interrogation rooms where beatings, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture were routine. Prisoners were forced to sign confessions, often dictated by their interrogators, which were then filed as evidence of guilt. The Gestapo rarely needed proof, suspicion was sufficient for imprisonment. Torture served not only to extract information, but also to break the will of resistance networks. Some prisoners resisted heroically, refusing to betray comrades even under excruciating pain. Others, broken by suffering, revealed names and addresses that led to further arrests. The cycle of fear perpetuated itself, with each confession feeding new files and new investigations. Survivors of these interrogations often carried lifelong scars, both physical and psychological. The Gestapo perfected cruelty under the guise of legality, embedding terror into its procedures. To resist meant to risk not only death but unimaginable suffering. The campaign against political enemies extended beyond Germany's borders. Exiled leaders of the SPD and KPD continued to publish newspapers and organize resistance, but the Gestapo tracked their activities relentlessly. Agents infiltrated exile networks, planted informants, and coordinated with foreign police forces to monitor and harass opponents. Kidnappings and assassinations abroad were rare but not unheard of, demonstrating the Gestapo's reach beyond the Reich. Inside Germany, the exile press was smuggled in, but distribution was perilous, often leading to immediate arrest. The Gestapo's transnational campaign illustrated its determination to annihilate opposition wherever it might exist. It was not enough to silence dissent at home, the very memory of resistance had to be erased. Exiles found themselves hunted, isolated, and often disheartened by the futility of their efforts. By severing ties between exiled leaders and the German populace, the Gestapo ensured that underground resistance was starved of guidance. Political exile became a lonely, desperate existence under constant threat. By the mid-1930s, the Gestapo had succeeded in crushing organized political opposition in Germany. The communists were shattered, the socialists dismantled, and the unions eradicated. Concentration camps, once filled primarily with political prisoners, had become permanent fixtures of Nazi rule. The Gestapo's victory was not merely physical but psychological. Germans learned that defiance led to disappearance, suffering, and often death. What made this repression so devastating was its thoroughness, combining street-level violence, bureaucratic precision, and ideological zeal. The Gestapo demonstrated that terror could be systematized, turning police work into political warfare. The defeat of Germany's democratic forces cleared the path for the regime's racial and genocidal policies to follow. Without political resistance, the Nazis could focus their energies on reshaping society according to their twisted vision. The crushing of political enemies was thus not only a chapter of repression, but the prologue to catastrophe. In silence and fear, the Nazi police state was born fully armed. The Gestapo was not a vast army patrolling the streets of Germany. It was a relatively small organization, numbering only a few thousand officers for a population of over 60 million. Its reach, however, was amplified by the participation of ordinary Germans who became informants, denunciators, and sometimes willing collaborators. Case after case reveals how neighbors, colleagues, or even relatives transformed private disputes into matters of state security. A man who quarreled with his neighbor over a fence might denounce him for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. A jealous co-worker, seeking a promotion, might whisper that his rival had criticized Hitler at the factory. In such ways, the Gestapo thrived not on omniscience, but on the steady drip of information volunteered by citizens. The machinery of repression depended on these denunciations, which were taken seriously, investigated, and recorded in files that could determine life or death. Fear was multiplied by suspicion, and suspicion was magnified by self-interest. Everyday grievances were weaponized, binding the people to the secret police. In Nazi Germany, private life became public risk, and silence was the only shield. One of the most chilling aspects of denunciation was how it turned the intimacy of neighborhoods into battlegrounds of fear. In small towns and villages, where everyone knew everyone else, the danger of a careless word grew exponentially. A woman complaining about food shortages might be accused by her neighbor of undermining morale. A local teacher who failed to deliver enthusiastic Nazi greetings in the classroom might be branded politically unreliable by a parent. The Gestapo encouraged this behavior by rewarding denunciators with praise or immunity, while punishing those who failed to report suspicious activity. Case files show that many denunciations came not from political conviction, but from petty resentments and rivalries. A dispute over property, inheritance, or even romantic jealousy could be disguised as loyalty to the Reich. The result was an atmosphere where private grudges became matters of national security. In such a climate, trust disintegrated. A word spoken too loudly, a gesture misinterpreted, could bring the dreaded knock on the door. The Gestapo did not need to watch everyone, because everyone was watching for them. At the heart of this culture of denunciation was fear of being denounced oneself. Many Germans participated in denunciations not out of zeal, but as a form of self-defense. By reporting others, they diverted suspicion from themselves and demonstrated loyalty to the state. Employers denounced workers to avoid being accused of harboring dissent. Teachers denounced parents or students to protect their own careers. Even family members sometimes betrayed one another, believing that silence would condemn them by association. Gestapo files contain chilling records of husbands turning in wives, parents reporting children, and siblings denouncing each other. This disintegration of family bonds was one of the most corrosive aspects of Nazi terror. It stripped individuals of the last refuge of trust, leaving them isolated and vulnerable. The Gestapo understood that fear divided communities more effectively than any army. It was terror by proxy, where survival meant sacrificing others. In such a society, intimacy itself became dangerous, and isolation was safety. The bureaucratic efficiency of the Gestapo transformed these denunciations into instruments of repression. Each report, no matter how trivial, was carefully filed, cross-referenced, and attached to a growing dossier. Officers often acted quickly, summoning suspects for interrogation or placing them under surveillance. The language of legality cloaked these actions in legitimacy, even when based on nothing more than hearsay. A single denunciation could destroy a career, end an education, or result in imprisonment in a concentration camp. Suspects rarely had the chance to confront their accusers, as the Gestapo operated in secrecy, protecting the identities of informants. This secrecy reinforced the culture of fear. No one knew who had spoken against them, and everyone feared it might be anyone. Innocence was irrelevant. For once inside the Gestapo system, guilt was assumed. The weight of a stamped file was often enough to seal a person's fate. In this way, the Gestapo weaponized paperwork as effectively as pistols. A denunciation was a bullet wrapped in bureaucratic formality. Examples of everyday Germans destroyed by denunciation abound. One woman, accused by her neighbor of making a joke about Hitler's mustache, was dragged from her home and subjected to weeks of brutal interrogation. A factory worker, overheard muttering complaints about long hours, was denounced by a rival and sent to Dachau. A student, reported by a classmate for reading banned literature, disappeared into a prison system that his family never saw again. These were not leaders of resistance or political activists, but ordinary people caught in the crosshairs of personal vendettas. Their fates reveal the fragility of daily life under the Nazi police state, where the line between private frustration and public crime was erased. The Gestapo thrived not by catching conspiracies, but by punishing individuals for the smallest deviations. This randomness made fear universal, as no one could predict what might trigger suspicion. A word, a joke, or a sigh could prove fatal. Life became a constant performance of loyalty, exhausting and dangerous. In Nazi Germany, survival meant acting the part of a believer, whether one believed or not. The climate of distrust extended into workplaces, where the Gestapo cultivated informants to monitor morale and loyalty. Factories, offices, and even schools became extensions of surveillance. A worker who complained about wages could be accused of sabotage. A teacher reluctant to join the Hitler Youth could be denounced for disloyalty. Employees often turned on one another, using denunciations as tools for advancement. Those who wished to remove rivals or gain favor with superiors found the Gestapo a willing ally. In such environments, ambition and fear combined to create a poisonous atmosphere of suspicion. The result was not greater efficiency, but greater silence. Workers learned to mouth slogans, attend rallies, and avoid expressing doubts. The Gestapo transformed the workplace into a stage for ideological performance. Productivity mattered less than loyalty, and even loyalty was measured through fear. In such a system, genuine enthusiasm was rare. Survival demanded conformity, and conformity demanded silence. Religion, too, became a target of surveillance, and denunciations frequently emerged from tensions between faith and ideology. Priests who spoke too boldly against Nazi policies found themselves accused of undermining the morale of the people. Parishioners sometimes denounced clergy, whether out of genuine conviction or personal resentment. In one case, a pastor's sermon criticizing the euthanasia program was reported by a member of his own congregation, leading to his arrest. Jehovah's Witnesses, who refused to salute Hitler or serve in the military, were especially vulnerable, often denounced by neighbors who feared being implicated by association. The Gestapo encouraged these denunciations, framing them as acts of patriotic vigilance. Faith communities became fractured, torn apart by suspicion and betrayal. Where religion might have provided solace or resistance, it instead became another arena of fear. The Gestapo's reach extended into the pews, the pulpits, and the confessions of ordinary Germans. No sacred space was beyond suspicion. Even God's house echoed with whispers of betrayal. By the late 1930s, the climate of distrust in Nazi Germany was complete. The Gestapo had succeeded in turning society into a labyrinth of fear, where every word, gesture, or silence could be fatal. Ordinary Germans had become both victims and accomplices, their denunciations fueling the machinery of repression. Neighbors betrayed neighbors, families betrayed families, and trust became a memory. The Gestapo's genius lay in its ability to weaponize suspicion, creating a society where terror enforced itself. It did not need to monitor every home or workplace, for the people did it willingly, often eagerly, for them. In this way, the Gestapo magnified its limited numbers into an omnipotent force. The myth of all-seeing power was reinforced daily by the betrayals of ordinary life. Germans lived in a state of isolation, where silence was the only defense and conformity the only protection. The climate of distrust was not an accident, but a deliberate construction of terror. It ensured that the Gestapo's reign was not just imposed, but internalized, transforming society itself into a prison without walls. Once the Gestapo had eliminated organized political opposition, its focus shifted to reshaping German society according to Nazi ideals. Political dissent was no longer the only crime. Personal conduct, lifestyle, and private beliefs came under scrutiny. The regime's obsession with conformity meant that a social behavior, anything that deviated from the Nazi vision of discipline and loyalty, was considered a threat. Men and women who were unemployed, homeless, or simply unwilling to conform to community expectations could find themselves labeled asocial and targeted for arrest. The Gestapo did not define morality in terms of law, but in terms of ideology, where deviation equaled disloyalty. Alcoholics, beggars, and those deemed chronically lazy were swept up alongside genuine criminals, their existence portrayed as a stain on the racial community. These individuals were marked with black triangles in concentration camps, a symbol of their outcast status. The message was clear: in the Nazi state, there was no room for nonconformity, even in private life. What had once been matters of personal choice or misfortune became matters of state discipline. The Gestapo thus transformed morality into a political weapon. One of the most brutal campaigns waged by the Gestapo was against homosexual men. The Nazis viewed homosexuality as a direct threat to their vision of racial vitality, accusing gay men of undermining reproduction and corrupting German youth. In 1935, 75 of the German Criminal Code was expanded, dramatically broadening the definition of homosexual offences. The Gestapo seized upon this law to launch an aggressive campaign of arrests, interrogations, and imprisonment. Bars, clubs, and meeting places known to host gay men were raided, and those arrested were often forced to reveal the names of acquaintances. Files on suspected homosexuals multiplied, creating blacklists that destroyed careers and reputations. Many of those arrested were sent to concentration camps, where they were marked with the pink triangle and subjected to particularly harsh treatment. Survivors later recalled how camp guards singled them out for abuse, considering them among the lowest of prisoners. For many, imprisonment was a death sentence. The persecution of homosexuals revealed the Gestapo's role as an enforcer not just of political order, but of the Nazi moral code. The campaign against homosexuals was not limited to punishment. It also aimed at forced re-education. Some prisoners were subjected to humiliating medical experiments designed to cure them of their sexuality. Others were coerced into heterosexual relationships under Gestapo supervision, with the false hope of release if they conformed. The underlying goal was to erase homosexuality from German society by terrorizing individuals into silence and submission. Gestapo files reveal countless lives destroyed, not only through imprisonment but through the stigma of exposure, which led to job loss, social ostracism, and suicide. What made the persecution even more chilling was the complicity of ordinary Germans. Many denunciations against homosexuals came from neighbors, co-workers, or even family members who feared guilt by association. Private lives became public dangers, and intimacy itself was policed. This extension of terror into the bedroom showed the depth of the Gestapo's reach. The campaign was not about crime but about conformity, and it reduced love to treason. In the Nazi state, even desire was subject to surveillance. Religious dissent represented another form of nonconformity that the Gestapo sought to eradicate. Jehovah's Witnesses in particular were singled out for their refusal to swear loyalty to Hitler, salute the flag, or serve in the military. To the regime, such refusal was treasonous, an act of rebellion against the racial community. The Gestapo pursued witnesses with relentless energy, raiding homes, confiscating literature, and arresting entire families. Children were often taken from their parents and placed in Nazi institutions to be re-educated. Those who refused to renounce their faith were sent to concentration camps, where they wore purple triangles as a mark of their defiance. Remarkably, many witnesses held firm, continuing to practice their faith in secret despite brutal punishments. The Gestapo regarded them as particularly dangerous because their resistance was spiritual rather than political. Unlike communists or socialists, They could not be persuaded by ideology or broken by torture. Their unyielding stance highlighted the regime's inability to control belief, even as it tried to police every thought and action. For the Gestapo, religious faith became a battlefield. Minority faiths and sects also came under the Gestapo's gaze. Small Protestant groups that resisted Nazi interference were harassed, their leaders arrested, and their congregations infiltrated by informants. The Catholic Church, though too large to dismantle outright, faced waves of intimidation, with priests monitored for signs of dissent. Sermons that criticized Nazi policies were reported by parishioners, leading to Gestapo interrogations and imprisonment. Monasteries and convents were raided under suspicion of harboring political enemies or engaging in immoral practices. For ordinary believers, attending church could feel like an act under surveillance, with the fear that words spoken in confession or fellowship might be twisted into accusations. The Gestapo was determined to make religion conform to the Nazi worldview, subordinating faith to the state. Religious dissent was treated not as conscience, but as treachery. In this way, the secret police extended their reach into the sacred, turning churches and temples into contested ground. No place of worship was beyond suspicion. Spiritual freedom was crushed beneath the weight of ideology. The persecution of asocials further illustrated the Gestapo's function as guardian of conformity. Roma communities, long marginalized, were targeted as racially inferior and socially disruptive. Men and women accused of idleness, prostitution, or habitual crime were rounded up and shipped to camps. The definition of a social was deliberately broad, allowing the Gestapo to target anyone who did not fit the Nazi vision of discipline and productivity. Black Triangle prisoners in camps became symbols of those deemed unworthy of community. Many of them never returned, dying from forced labor, starvation, or execution. The campaign against asocials blurred the line between crime and lifestyle, turning poverty, misfortune, or non-conformity into offenses punishable by imprisonment or death. The Gestapo enforced a chilling message: to be safe, one had to fit perfectly into the racial and social mold of the regime. Individuality was dangerous, difference was suspect, and deviation was deadly. This campaign revealed the regime's obsession with molding society into a homogeneous collective. The Gestapo ensured that fear of exclusion was as powerful as fear of arrest. These campaigns of moral policing reveal the Gestapo's deeper function, not simply punishing crime, but enforcing ideology. The Nazi state was obsessed with creating a society that reflected its racial, cultural, and moral vision. The Gestapo served as the enforcer of this vision, ensuring that those who deviated were not only silenced, but erased from public life. Every arrest reinforced the message that there was only one acceptable way to live, love, and believe. For ordinary Germans, this meant that even apolitical lives were subject to scrutiny. A lifestyle choice, a romantic relationship, or a religious conviction could now mark one as an enemy of the state. Fear of exposure made people conform outwardly, but it also destroyed individuality, creativity, and personal freedom. The Gestapo succeeded not only in crushing opposition, but in shaping behavior through terror. Its power was measured not only in arrests, but in silences. In a society where even morality was politicized, conformity became the highest law, terror became the moral compass. By the eve of war in 1939, the Gestapo had firmly established itself as the guardian of Nazi morality and conformity. Political opposition had been eradicated, but the scope of repression had widened dramatically. Homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, minority faiths, Roma, and so-called asocials had joined the ranks of the persecuted. In every case, the Gestapo acted not as a traditional police force, but as the ideological enforcer of the regime's vision of society. Its files no longer contained only political cases, but records of private lives, intimate choices, and personal beliefs. Germans lived in a world where nothing was too small to escape surveillance, from a whispered joke to a forbidden romance. The climate of fear extended beyond politics into the very fabric of daily life. The Gestapo had succeeded in making conformity not just expected but compulsory. Those who strayed were branded, punished, and erased. In this way, the Gestapo became the silent architect of a society defined not by freedom but by fear. It was not merely a secret police, it was the conscience of a dictatorship. By 1939, as Hitler prepared to plunge Europe into war, the Nazi security apparatus had reached a new stage of consolidation. The Gestapo, once a Prussian experiment, had already become a national instrument of repression under Himmler and Heydrich. But with the coming of global conflict, repression needed to be systematized, centralized, and expanded. On September 27, 1939, the Reich Main Security Office, known by its German acronym Reichssicherheitshauptamt or RSHA, was officially created. This organization fused the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst SD, and the Kripo, or criminal police, into one vast empire of surveillance and control. Reinhard Heydrich, the calculating master of organization, was placed in charge, making him the most powerful policeman in Nazi Germany. The RSHA embodied the Nazi obsession with bureaucracy, filing, and paperwork, transforming terror into a matter of offices, desks, and departments. From its headquarters in Berlin, this institution directed a network that extended across Germany and into every occupied land. What had once been fragmented agencies now operated under one command. The Gestapo had found its place within an empire of terror. The RSHA was divided into departments, each tasked with different aspects of surveillance, repression, and intelligence. The Gestapo became Department Für, under the leadership of Heinrich Müller, a career police officer known for his cold efficiency. The SD, Heydrich's original intelligence service, was given responsibility for ideological monitoring, gathering reports on public opinion, morale, and loyalty. The Kripo handled ordinary criminal investigations, but even these were infused with ideological considerations, ensuring that crime was defined by Nazi values. Together, these divisions created a seamless apparatus where political policing, intelligence gathering, and criminal prosecution were fused. No distinction remained between public security and political conformity, they were one and the same. Bureaucratic charts, job titles, and departments gave the RSHA a veneer of normality, but beneath the structure lay the machinery of terror. Files could lead to arrests, arrests to camps, and camps to death. It was repression systematized into routine. The RSHA was both an office and a weapon, an institution where desks dictated destiny. The cooperation between the Gestapo and the SD was crucial to the RSHA's success. The SD, staffed with ideologues and intellectuals, monitored every aspect of German society, from conversations in pubs to sermons in churches. Their reports, compiled into thick dossiers, provided the Gestapo with raw intelligence about potential dissent. The Gestapo, in turn, acted on this information, carrying out arrests, interrogations, and deportations. The relationship was symbiotic. The SD provided the eyes and ears, while the Gestapo provided the fists and shackles. Together they created a feedback loop where suspicion generated arrests, and arrests confirmed suspicion. Ordinary Germans came to understand that even casual remarks might end up in an SD report, leading to a Gestapo summons. The collaboration blurred the line between surveillance and punishment. With the RSAG, Nazi terror was no longer reactive but proactive, designed to anticipate opposition before it could grow. The result was a society where fear preceded action. Terror became preventive rather than punitive. The RSHA was not confined to Germany. It was built to manage an expanding empire. As Nazi armies swept across Europe, RSHA departments followed, establishing offices in occupied territories. Gestapo branches were set up in Paris, Warsaw, Prague, and countless other cities, coordinating with local collaborators to impose control. The SD monitored morale among occupied populations, while the Gestapo hunted down resistance fighters, dissidents, and Jews. In this way, the RSHA became an exportable model of terror, replicating the police state across borders. Local populations often found themselves forced into complicity, as collaborators provided intelligence in exchange for favors or survival. The RSHA adapted its methods to each territory, but the principles remained the same: surveillance, denunciation, and brutal enforcement. From its Berlin headquarters, orders radiated outward, ensuring uniformity of terror. No matter where one lived under Nazi control, the methods of repression were familiar. The Gestapo, once a German institution, had become a European nightmare. Centralization under the RSHA also meant a new level of bureaucratic efficiency. Heydrich was obsessed with paperwork, believing that control lay in records, files, and precise categorization. Every arrest, every interrogation, every deportation was documented, often in multiple copies, creating mountains of paper that gave the illusion of order. In reality, this bureaucracy was a labyrinth designed to depersonalize human suffering. A prisoner was not a person but a file number. A deportation was not a tragedy, but a line in a report. This routinization of terror made repression sustainable, scalable, and impersonal. RSHA officers were trained to think of themselves as administrators, not executioners, even as their signatures condemned thousands. The language of forms and stamps replaced the language of morality. Murder was translated into bureaucracy. The RSHA institutionalized terror not as chaos but as procedure, turning atrocity into administration. This was the most chilling aspect of the Nazi state: evil dressed in the garments of order. The RSHA also absorbed the Gestapo's myth of omnipotence and magnified it across Europe. Ordinary Germans had long believed that the Gestapo was everywhere, and now this belief extended to occupied populations. Posters warned against resistance, rumors spread of informants in every cafe, and arrests confirmed the ever-present danger. In many territories, the fear of denunciation was even greater than in Germany itself, as conquered peoples faced the double threat of local collaborators and Nazi officers. The RSHA understood the value of reputation. Its power depended not only on what it could do, but on what people believed it could do. The myth of omniscience became self-fulfilling, as silence spread faster than dissent. Fear was multiplied by rumor, and rumor became as effective as surveillance. Even those who had never seen a Gestapo officer acted as if they were being watched. The RSHA thrived on this atmosphere, sustaining terror with minimal manpower. Perception was weaponized as much as reality. With the RSHA, Nazi terror became centrally organized, integrated, and unrelenting. No longer fragmented between regional police forces, the apparatus was now a single, coordinated machine. Orders came from Berlin, but their effects were felt in every village, town, and occupied city. This centralization allowed the regime to act with terrifying speed, shifting resources where needed and maintaining uniformity in policy. Resistance could be crushed before it spread. Dissent could be silenced before it was spoken. The RSHA's command structure ensured that local officers operated with both initiative and obedience, adapting tactics to circumstances while always following the ideological line. Terror was no longer ad hoc but systematic, guided by ideology and executed through bureaucracy. In this sense, the RSHA was the culmination of Himmler and Heydrich's vision. It was not merely a police force, but a state within a state, a dark empire dedicated to surveillance and destruction. Its shadow stretched across an entire continent. By the outbreak of the Second World War, the Gestapo's place within the RSHA ensured its centrality to the Nazi project. No longer a mere instrument of domestic repression, it was now a cog in a vast machinery that managed both Germany and its expanding empire. The Gestapo provided the muscle, the SD the intelligence, and the bureaucracy the framework. Together they created a system where ideology, surveillance, and violence were inseparable. The RSHA was the brain of Nazi terror, directing its limbs across Europe, ensuring that repression was coordinated, efficient, and total. In Berlin, officers shuffled papers and wrote reports, but their decisions echoed in cells, camps, and killing fields. The centralization of the Gestapo within the RSHA marked the moment when terror became institutionalized at the highest level of the Nazi state. What had once been a secret police was now part of a continental empire of fear. The Gestapo had been absorbed into a machine greater than itself, and that machine would drive the Holocaust and the war to their darkest depths. When Nazi armies surged across Europe between 1939 and 1940, the Wehrmacht carried tanks and soldiers, but the Gestapo carried fear. As territory after territory fell, Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, the Gestapo established offices almost immediately. These were often set up in former police stations, government buildings, or requisitioned mansions, transforming familiar local landmarks into places of dread. In Warsaw, Paris, and Prague, new Gestapo headquarters became symbols of occupation, their mere addresses whispered with terror by civilians. The Gestapo arrived with clear instructions: crush resistance, monitor populations, and enforce Nazi racial policy. Officers from Berlin often led these branches, but they quickly absorbed local police and administrators into their machinery. The RSHA in Berlin issued directives, while field officers tailored their methods to the character of each occupied society. What remained constant was the iron core of repression: arrest, torture, deportation, and execution. No country under German control escaped the shadow of the Gestapo. The secret police had become an exportable weapon of occupation. In occupied Poland, the Gestapo's role was particularly brutal, reflecting the Nazi vision of the East as a zone for racial conquest and annihilation. Gestapo officers worked hand in glove with the SS and Einsatzgruppen, carrying out mass arrests, executions, and deportations of Polish elites, intellectuals, and clergy. Universities were closed, teachers were arrested, and thousands of community leaders were executed in operations such as the Intelligence Action. Resistance networks were relentlessly hunted, their members tortured and executed in Gestapo prisons. The Warsaw Gestapo headquarters on Succa Avenue became synonymous with terror, where countless Poles were interrogated, beaten, and killed. Jewish communities were targeted early, with the Gestapo overseeing ghettoization and later deportations to extermination camps. Informants and collaborators were recruited from local populations, creating webs of betrayal that eroded trust within Polish society. For Poles, the Gestapo was not a distant power, but an immediate and daily terror. Unlike in the West, where the Gestapo's role was often to suppress dissent, in Poland it was to annihilate entire communities. It was terror in its rawest, most murderous form. In Western Europe, the Gestapo's methods were more nuanced, but no less effective. In France, the Rue des Sarcés in Paris became the central Gestapo office, a place where countless resistants were interrogated and tortured. While the Wehrmacht maintained order in the streets, it was the Gestapo that operated in the shadows, infiltrating networks and dismantling underground organizations. French police forces, particularly the milice under Vichy, collaborated eagerly, providing intelligence and carrying out arrests on behalf of the Germans. Collaboration allowed the Gestapo to multiply its reach, compensating for its relatively small numbers. The Dutch police in Amsterdam, and later in Rotterdam, played similar roles, helping the Gestapo hunt Jews and resistance fighters. In Belgium, collaboration was equally significant, with local fascist groups feeding names and information. Everywhere the Gestapo thrived by exploiting local divisions, turning neighbors against one another, just as it had done in Germany. The methods of denunciation and surveillance that worked at home were exported abroad. The result was a continent where terror was shared between occupiers and collaborators. The Gestapo's collaboration with local authorities was not accidental but strategic. The RSHA in Berlin understood that its limited manpower could not control entire nations without assistance. Therefore, Gestapo officers deliberately cultivated alliances with local police, gendarmeries, and even criminal elements. These groups were given incentives, power, protection, or material reward in exchange for loyalty to the occupiers. Collaboration was presented as pragmatic survival, but in reality it bound local forces to Nazi crimes. In occupied Norway, Vidkun Quisling's regime worked with the Gestapo to suppress resistance. In the Netherlands, Dutch police units were directly responsible for rounding up Jews, sending tens of thousands to their deaths in camps like Auschwitz. In France, collaboration blurred the line between occupier and occupied as French officers carried out raids under Gestapo supervision. The Gestapo became less a foreign invader and more a parasite, feeding on local structures of authority. This ensured that repression was efficient, far-reaching, and devastating. Collaboration made terror a shared enterprise. The Gestapo also exported its techniques of interrogation and torture across Europe. In every occupied capital, Gestapo cellars and interrogation chambers became infamous. Prisoners were subjected to beatings, electric shocks, water torture, and psychological torment designed to extract confessions or betrayals. Survivors described the dreaded walk through the corridors of Gestapo offices, where screams echoed and fear was palpable in the walls. Torture was not only a tool for information but a performance of power, designed to terrify those who resisted and silence those who might. Many victims never survived, their bodies disposed of secretly or sent to concentration camps. In Warsaw, the Gestapo's reputation was such that entire neighborhoods trembled at the mere sight of its cars. In Paris, the mere mention of La Gestapo spread dread, even among those uninvolved in resistance. These methods, honed in Germany during the 1930s, were refined and exported as standard practice. The Gestapo carried with it not just files and officers but the culture of cruelty. Torture became its universal language across occupied Europe. Deportation was another key element of the Gestapo's export of terror. Jews, Roma, political prisoners, and forced laborers were rounded up under Gestapo supervision in every occupied country. Officers coordinated with the SS to manage transportation to ghettos, concentration camps, and extermination sites. Lists were drawn up with bureaucratic precision, often with the help of local collaborators who provided names and addresses. In Amsterdam, The Gestapo, aided by Dutch police, organized mass roundups of Jews, including the arrest of Anne Frank and her family. In Belgium, thousands were deported from the Mechelen transit camp under Gestapo authority. In France, the infamous Val d'Oeuvre roundup in 1942 saw over 13,000 Jews arrested by French police at the Gestapo's orders. These deportations revealed the terrifying efficiency of combined forces, Nazi planners, Gestapo enforcers, and local collaborators working in unison. Deportation was not only logistical but psychological, spreading terror among those left behind. Entire communities lived in constant fear of the knock on the door. For millions, the Gestapo was the hand that delivered them to death. Resistance movements across Europe faced the relentless pursuit of the Gestapo. Underground newspapers, sabotage groups, and partisan fighters were infiltrated, dismantled, and executed. In France, leaders of the resistance like Jean Moulin were captured and tortured by Gestapo officers, their networks compromised. In Poland, the Home Army faced constant surveillance, with Gestapo officers deploying informants to penetrate their ranks. In Czechoslovakia, the assassination of Heydrich in 1942 unleashed a wave of Gestapo-led reprisals, including the destruction of Lidis. The Gestapo used fear strategically, making examples of resistance fighters by executing them publicly or deporting entire families. Resistance was never completely crushed, but its cost was enormous, paid in blood, betrayal, and silence. The Gestapo became the nightmare of every partisan, its presence a constant shadow over underground operations. Its ability to combine intelligence gathering, collaboration, and ruthless punishment made it one of the most feared opponents of the resistance. In every occupied country, the secret police were the occupiers' sharpest weapon. They turned defiance into death sentences. By the height of the war, the Gestapo had become not merely Germany's secret police, but Europe's, its offices, dotted the map from Oslo to Athens, from Paris to Warsaw, creating a continent-wide network of terror. Through collaboration, intelligence, torture, and deportation, it extended Nazi ideology into every corner of occupied life. No city was untouched, no village entirely safe. Its power lay not in numbers but in fear, amplified by the complicity of local authorities and the silence of frightened populations. The Gestapo exported not only its methods but its mythology, ensuring that its reputation preceded its arrival. For millions across Europe, the name alone symbolized torture, deportation, and death. The Gestapo had succeeded in transforming occupation into terror, binding conquered nations in chains of fear. It was no longer a German institution, but a continental one, the dark hand of Nazi rule. In every whisper of suspicion and every locked door at night, its presence was felt. The Gestapo had become Europe's shadow. From the very beginning of Nazi rule in 1933, Germany's Jews were among the first to feel the heavy hand of the Gestapo. While SA thugs and Nazi Party activists carried out street violence, it was the Gestapo that turned harassment into systematic policy. Early measures such as the April 1933 boycott of Jewish businesses were enforced not only by stormtroopers, but also by police supervision, ensuring compliance and reporting violators. Shop fronts were daubed with slogans, windows smashed, and customers intimidated, while the Gestapo carefully monitored reactions. Their agents recorded the names of Jews who resisted or complained, and even of Germans who dared to shop in Jewish stores. These files became the beginnings of a larger surveillance network, cataloging an entire community for future repression. The Gestapo's presence transformed crude violence into organized persecution. What had been local boycotts became a coordinated state policy under police supervision. Jews quickly learned that the police were no longer protectors but enforcers of discrimination. The Gestapo had begun the process of turning prejudice into persecution. Surveillance was at the heart of Gestapo operations against Jews. As early as 1933, officers opened files on Jewish organizations, synagogues, and community leaders, monitoring sermons, speeches, and cultural events. Reports flowed back to Berlin describing gatherings, charity drives, and even private conversations that betrayed anxiety or opposition. Every Jewish newspaper was scrutinized, every public statement dissected. In some cases, the Gestapo planted informants within communities, individuals who attended synagogue or social clubs, only to report names and comments. This created a climate of suspicion that extended even into spaces of worship and family life. Jewish leaders were forced to live with the knowledge that anything they said could appear in a Gestapo report. The goal was not only to monitor, but to intimidate, ensuring that Jews felt constantly watched and powerless. Surveillance was a form of persecution in itself, eroding any sense of privacy or security. The Jewish community became one of the most closely monitored groups in Nazi Germany. Files accumulated, lives were catalogued, and destinies were quietly sealed. The Gestapo also played a key role in the state's early legal assault on Jewish life. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship, outlawed marriages and sexual relations with Aryans, and defined Jewish identity according to racial categories. While these laws were written by Nazi legislators, it was the Gestapo that enforced them in daily life. Officers investigated suspected violations, interrogated couples, and brought charges for racial defilement. Informants often reported neighbors or co-workers accused of such crimes, and the Gestapo followed up with ruthless efficiency. Young men and women caught in relationships across racial lines were humiliated, imprisoned, or sent to camps. Beyond these sensational cases, the Gestapo monitored compliance with restrictions on Jewish employment, education, and property rights. Each file represented not just an individual, but an entire system of exclusion. The Gestapo turned law into terror, ensuring that Jews understood there was no escape from Nazi racial policy. Through enforcement, the Gestapo made ideology a daily reality. By 1935, Jewish life in Germany was already shrinking under the pressure of police enforcement. In the late 1930s, as Nazi anti-Semitism intensified, the Gestapo became increasingly focused on driving Jews out of Germany. The regime encouraged emigration, but this was no humanitarian gesture. It was persecution by expulsion. Jews who applied for visas found themselves under Gestapo scrutiny, their property inventoried, their finances seized. The Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration, run by Adolf Eichmann under the SS, coordinated closely with the Gestapo to pressure Jews into leaving. Every departure required paperwork, permits, and humiliating inspections, often accompanied by bribes or forced donations to Nazi coffers. The Gestapo ensured that Jews who remained were harassed until they too considered flight. For many, the process was deliberately humiliating, designed to strip them of dignity as well as possessions. Families leaving the country were often reduced to poverty, their wealth transferred to the state. Emigration became both a tool of racial policy and a source of profit for the Nazi regime. The Gestapo stood at the center of this machinery, ensuring that departure was never voluntary but coerced. It was persecution disguised as escape. The November pogrom of 1938, known as Kristallnacht, revealed the Gestapo's deepening role in Jewish persecution. While the violence of smashed windows, burning synagogues, and murdered Jews, was carried out by SA men and party activists, the Gestapo was present to direct, record, and exploit the aftermath. Officers compiled detailed reports on the destruction, arrests, and community reactions, forwarding them to Berlin. Most chillingly, the Gestapo used Kristallnacht as an opportunity to arrest tens of thousands of Jewish men and send them to concentration camps like Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. For many, this was the first direct experience of the camp system, a terrifying preview of what awaited. The Gestapo instructed local police not to interfere with the violence, but to prepare for the wave of arrests. Jewish community leaders were interrogated and humiliated, their organizations stripped of remaining influence. Insurance claims were blocked, with the Gestapo ensuring that Jews paid for the destruction inflicted on them. Kristallnacht transformed persecution into open terror, with the Gestapo as its orchestrator. The pogrom marked a turning point towards systematic annihilation. Even before the war, Gestapo files on Jews revealed the regime's obsession with total control. Every Jewish community organization, from youth groups to cultural associations, was catalogued. Leaders were profiled, membership lists seized, and meetings infiltrated. The Gestapo knew who attended Hebrew classes, who supported Zionist organizations, and who tried to maintain traditions in the face of growing persecution. Their files recorded not only names but attitudes, opinions, and behaviors. This intelligence was not merely archival, it shaped policy. Communities considered too resilient were targeted for special harassment. Rabbis and teachers were singled out for interrogation, their authority undermined through constant surveillance. These files later became essential tools for deportation, as the Gestapo already had the names and addresses of entire families. What began as surveillance evolved into the groundwork for genocide. By 1939, Jewish life in Germany existed only under the shadow of Gestapo files. The community was mapped, monitored, and prepared for destruction. For Jews, daily life under Gestapo scrutiny became an ordeal of constant humiliation and fear. Letters were opened, telephones tapped, and movements tracked. Many were summoned for questioning, forced to endure hours of interrogation about their activities, finances, or associations. Even the most mundane actions could provoke suspicion: visiting a friend, writing to relatives abroad, or receiving foreign mail. Jews were subjected to arbitrary fines, raids, and property seizures. Each encounter left a mark on Gestapo files, building a cumulative record of evidence for future persecution. This erosion of normal life left communities isolated and demoralized. Friendships strained under the suspicion that any careless remark could be reported. For children, the Gestapo's presence meant growing up in an atmosphere where innocence was impossible. Every family under siege, daily existence became a survival strategy, as Jews navigated a system designed to make them disappear. By the eve of war, the Gestapo had succeeded in turning their very lives into a crime. Jewish identity itself had been criminalized. By the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, the Gestapo had transformed anti-Semitism from prejudice into a state project. Through boycotts, surveillance, harassment, and forced emigration, it had already reduced Germany's Jewish population from 500,000 to a fraction of its former size. The files compiled over years of scrutiny now provided the infrastructure for deportations and mass murder. What appeared as isolated measures, an interrogation, a confiscated passport, a denied insurance claim, were in fact pieces of a larger puzzle. The Gestapo had built the bureaucratic foundation for the Holocaust before the term even existed. Its officers saw themselves not as persecutors but as administrators, managing what they called the Jewish question. The Jewish community, once integrated into German life, had been reduced to a monitored, segregated, and despised minority. The Gestapo had overseen the destruction of livelihoods, the erosion of dignity, and the preparation for annihilation. Before the gas chambers, there were files and interrogations. Before Auschwitz, there was the Gestapo, and it was here, in these years before the final solution, that genocide began in paperwork and police reports. Kristallnacht in November 1938 was not only a pogrom, but also a rehearsal for genocide, and the Gestapo stood at its center. While SA men and party activists lit fires and smashed windows, Gestapo officers supervised arrests, compiled reports, and ensured that violence served state policy. In Berlin, Munich, and Vienna, Gestapo headquarters sent out detailed orders instructing police not to interfere with destruction, but to be ready for mass detentions. The result was the arrest of over 30,000 Jewish men, rounded up and sent to concentration camps. The Gestapo carefully documented these arrests, filling their files with names that would later reappear in deportation lists. Survivors of Dachau and Buchenwald recalled the terror of those first internments, where humiliation, beatings, and forced labor foreshadowed far darker days. Kristallnacht demonstrated that Jews would no longer be merely harassed, they would be imprisoned, deported, and eliminated from public life. The Gestapo's role was not chaotic, but bureaucratic, turning mob violence into state-sanctioned terror. Files, orders, and signatures transformed smashed glass into a calculated act of policy. From this moment, the Gestapo's handprint on Jewish persecution was unmistakable. Kristallnacht marked the beginning of systematic escalation. When war erupted in September 1939, the Gestapo's mission expanded beyond Germany's borders into the conquered lands of Poland. Here Jews were not just isolated, but concentrated, forced into ghettos under Gestapo supervision. Orders from Berlin dictated the creation of Jewish councils, or Judenräte, compelled to carry out Nazi decrees under Gestapo threat. Ghettos in Warsaw, Waroj, and Krakow became vast prisons where starvation, disease, and overcrowding killed thousands before deportations even began. The Gestapo worked alongside SS units to enforce curfews, confiscate property, and brutally punish resistance. Reports flowed back to Berlin detailing the success of these measures, couched in bureaucratic language that masked human suffering. The ghettos were both a holding pen and a laboratory for genocide, testing methods of control and annihilation. The Gestapo's presence ensured that escape was nearly impossible, and informants were recruited even within ghetto walls. Every loaf of bread, every clandestine school, and every act of survival was shadowed by the fear of discovery. The ghetto was a place of life suspended, and the Gestapo held the keys. Its hand guided the transition from persecution to extermination. The deportations of Jews from ghettos to concentration and extermination camps were overseen with Gestapo precision. Each transport required paperwork, lists of names, addresses, and possessions. Gestapo officers coordinated with the SS and railway authorities, ensuring that trains ran on time, not for commerce, but for death. In Warsaw, roundups known as Aktion were carried out by SS men and local collaborators under Gestapo supervision. Jews were herded through the streets, often beaten or shot, before being forced into cattle cars. Every detail, from the number of deportees to the confiscation of luggage, was recorded in Gestapo files. These files gave the illusion of legality to a crime without precedent. Deportation was framed as resettlement, but the Gestapo knew that the destination was death. In this bureaucratic process, human beings became cargo, reduced to numbers on a page. Families were torn apart, communities erased, and identities obliterated. The Gestapo's role was to ensure that nothing was left to chance. With efficiency and cold calculation, they turned deportation into genocide's logistical backbone. The Gestapo's presence was equally critical in Western Europe once deportations began there in 1942. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, Jewish families were arrested at night, often with the assistance of local police, and delivered to transit camps. The Vel de Civ roundup in Paris, where over 13,000 Jews were arrested in 2 days, was carried out by French police, but orchestrated by Gestapo officers. In Amsterdam, the Gestapo worked closely with Dutch collaborators to arrest thousands, including the Frank family, whose story later revealed the machinery of betrayal. Transit camps like Drancy, Westerbork, and Mechelen became staging points for trains eastward, all under Gestapo oversight. Every country had its own collaboration, but the blueprint was the same: lists compiled, families seized, property confiscated, and trains dispatched. The Gestapo's efficiency ensured that even countries with small Jewish populations saw significant numbers deported. In Belgium, entire communities were wiped out in carefully scheduled transports. In France, Jewish resistance networks fought desperately to smuggle children to safety, but the Gestapo's files made escape increasingly rare. Across the continent, the Gestapo became the face of deportation. Its shadow lay over every station platform and every departing train. Coordination with the SS was at the heart of this machinery. While the SS built and operated extermination camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, the Gestapo supplied the victims. Officers ensured that quotas were met, that ghettos were emptied, and that trains left on schedule. RSA Department 4, under Heinrich Müller, acted as the administrative hub, translating Hitler's genocidal vision into daily orders. Gestapo officials reported on the progress of deportations, using chilling euphemisms such as special treatment to describe mass killings. They worked hand in glove with Eichmann's office, which organized transports and coordinated across occupied territories. The Gestapo's role was less visible than that of the SS executioners, but it was no less essential. Without the Gestapo, there would have been no systematic identification, no orderly deportation, no enforcement of quotas. Their files ensured that individuals were tracked, communities were mapped, and every Jew remained within reach of the state. Genocide required not only killers but administrators. The Gestapo supplied the infrastructure of annihilation. It was the bridge between ideology and extermination. Inside Germany, the Gestapo continued to enforce anti-Jewish measures with relentless vigor. Jews who had not yet been deported were subjected to humiliating restrictions, forced labor, and constant surveillance. In Berlin, Jews were ordered to wear the yellow star from September 1941, a measure strictly enforced by Gestapo patrols. Those caught in public without the badge were arrested, interrogated, and often deported. Raids on Jewish homes became routine, stripping families of possessions and herding them to collection points. The Gestapo's files, accumulated since the 1930s, now facilitated deportations with terrifying ease. Every address, every family member, every previous encounter was recorded. For the remaining Jews in Germany, life became a countdown to arrest. Gestapo officers appeared without warning, often in the early morning hours, to drag families from their beds. Neighbors watched silently, fearing association, while the machinery of removal continued without pause. In Germany itself, the Gestapo ensured that genocide was not something distant but present, carried out in familiar streets. The final solution began at home, with the Gestapo as its enforcer. The Gestapo also played a decisive role in crushing Jewish resistance. Uprisings in ghettos and camps, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, were met with overwhelming force, coordinated by Gestapo and SS units. Informants had already infiltrated resistance networks, ensuring that the secret police often knew plans in advance. Yet even when caught by surprise, the Gestapo responded with brutal efficiency. In Warsaw, they directed house-to-house searches, burning entire blocks to flush out fighters. Thousands were executed or deported to Treblinka as punishment. In camps, the Gestapo punished even minor acts of defiance with torture and death, ensuring that survival was equated with submission. Their files were used to identify ringleaders, ensuring that collective punishment could be targeted with precision. Resistance was never entirely crushed, but its cost was staggering. For every act of defiance, the Gestapo extracted 100-fold in blood. Their goal was not only to destroy resistance, but to make the very thought of defiance unthinkable. Terror was their chosen weapon, wielded with merciless consistency. By the height of the Holocaust, the Gestapo had transformed from a political police force into one of the chief architects of genocide. From Kristallnacht to the ghettos, from deportation lists to concentration camp deliveries, their role was essential. They were not the ones who operated the gas chambers, but without them, the chambers would have been empty. Their files mapped communities, their orders filled trains, their interrogations broke resistance, and their supervision turned murder into routine. The Gestapo represented the administrative face of genocide, proving that extermination required not only ideology and violence, but also paperwork and police power. Every arrest, every deportation, every disappearance bore their fingerprints. The final solution was not only carried out in camps, but also in Gestapo offices, where pens, files, and typewriters condemned millions. Their work bridged the gap between policy and murder. In the story of the Holocaust, the Gestapo were not merely enforcers, but organizers. They turned persecution into annihilation, and in doing so they helped create the darkest crime in human history. As the war expanded across Europe, resistance movements emerged in every occupied country, challenging Nazi rule through sabotage, clandestine newspapers, and underground networks. From the forests of Poland to the streets of Paris, men and women risked everything to strike back at the occupiers. The Gestapo, however, was tasked with ensuring that such defiance was crushed before it could spread. Resistance was not treated as patriotic struggle, but as treason punishable by death. The Gestapo's mandate was simple: identify, infiltrate, and annihilate. They relied on intelligence from the SD, informants within communities, and files meticulously compiled on suspects. The Gestapo did not merely react to resistance, but sought to preempt it, destroying networks before they could mature. This proactive strategy meant constant surveillance of suspected sympathizers, often leading to sweeping arrests. Entire groups could be dismantled with the capture of a single courier or the discovery of one hidden press. Fear was their most effective weapon, spreading suspicion and mistrust among those who dared to resist. In every occupied territory, the Gestapo became the embodiment of terror against defiance. In France, the Gestapo's battle against the resistance was relentless and ruthless. Paris became a hub of underground activity, with clandestine newspapers, sabotage cells, and networks aiding downed Allied airmen. The Gestapo responded by infiltrating these groups with double agents and informers, sowing mistrust among comrades. Arrests were followed by brutal interrogations at infamous locations such as 84 Avenue Foch in Paris, where prisoners endured beatings, starvation, and electric shocks. Resistance leaders like Jean Moulin, a unifying figure of the French underground, were captured and tortured until death under Gestapo custody. The Gestapo often worked closely with collaborators, particularly the Vichy police and the fascist milice, who provided local knowledge and manpower. Roundups became common, with entire resistance cells captured in a single night of raids, Deportations to concentration camps, such as Buchenwald or Mauthausen, followed, ensuring that many resistance fighters never returned. Despite the heroism of the French underground, the Gestapo's efficiency exacted a terrible toll. Every leaflet, every act of sabotage carried the risk of betrayal. For the resistance, survival was as precarious as defiance. In Poland, the Gestapo faced perhaps the strongest and most determined underground movement of the war. The Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, commanded hundreds of thousands of fighters and maintained networks of couriers, printers, and saboteurs. The Gestapo responded with systematic infiltration, relying on informants recruited through threats, blackmail, or promises of reward. Arrests were often conducted on a massive scale, with whole neighborhoods swept clean of suspected partisans. Interrogations in Gestapo prisons in Warsaw, Krakow, and Lublin became notorious for their savagery. Prisoners were beaten, mutilated, and tortured until they revealed the names of comrades, which in turn led to further arrests. The Warsaw Uprising of 1944 was met with Gestapo-led reprisals of staggering brutality, including mass executions of civilians. The Gestapo's files on Polish resistance groups grew into vast archives, each document representing a life under threat. Despite this, the Polish underground persisted, striking back in acts of sabotage and assassination. For the Gestapo, Poland was not simply an occupied territory, it was a battleground for control of a nation's spirit. Here, their war against resistance was total. In Germany itself, resistance was rare, but no less courageous, and the Gestapo moved swiftly to eliminate it. The White Rose movement, led by students in Munich such as Hans and Sophie Scholl, distributed leaflets condemning the regime and calling for passive resistance. Their activities were modest compared to underground armies abroad, but the Gestapo treated them with the utmost seriousness. Informants reported the distribution of leaflets, and by February 1943, the Gestapo had identified and arrested the leaders. Interrogations were swift, brutal, and designed to extract confessions. Within days, the Scholls and their comrade Christoph Probst were tried in the People's Court and executed by guillotine. The Gestapo's rapid destruction of the White Rose revealed the fragility of resistance within Germany, where surveillance was omnipresent and dissent isolated. The files on the White Rose, later discovered, showed the precision with which the Gestapo monitored even small student groups. Their legacy endured, but their lives were cut short by a machine of repression. In Germany, the Gestapo proved that even whispers of dissent could be silenced. Resistance was crushed at its birth. The Gestapo's methods of interrogation were infamous across occupied Europe. Once arrested, resistance fighters were subjected to beatings, deprivation, and psychological torment designed to break both body and spirit. Torture chambers in Gestapo offices became synonymous with terror. In Paris, prisoners remembered the sound of screams echoing down corridors. In Warsaw, survivors spoke of being hung by their arms for hours. The goal was not only to extract information, but to instill fear in others who might consider resistance. Interrogators often presented prisoners with fabricated evidence, sowing doubt about their comrades' loyalty. Families were sometimes threatened or arrested to coerce confessions. Even silence could be punished with brutal beatings, leaving prisoners permanently scarred or dead. Many did not survive these sessions, their bodies quietly disposed of. Those who did were often deported to concentration camps, broken and weakened. The Gestapo's cruelty became part of its reputation, deterring many from joining underground groups. Torture was not an accident of war, but a deliberate tactic of control. It was terror institutionalized, designed to crush hope. Infiltration was another cornerstone of Gestapo's strategy against resistance movements. Informants were recruited from all walks of life: criminals seeking leniency, neighbors with grudges, or frightened citizens pressured into cooperation. Double agents were planted within resistance networks, feeding the Gestapo information while pretending to be loyal comrades. The result was devastating. Resistance groups often collapsed from within, betrayed by those they trusted. The Gestapo maintained extensive networks of informants, whose reports filled endless files. Many arrests began not with surveillance but with a denunciation, proving that the Gestapo's greatest weapon was often fear itself. This system created an atmosphere of mistrust, where even allies suspected one another of betrayal. In France, entire resistance networks fell after a single informer revealed safe houses. In Poland, Gestapo double agents infiltrated courier lines, leading to mass arrests. In Germany, even small circles of dissent were penetrated, as with the White Rose. Infiltration allowed the Gestapo to multiply its reach far beyond its numbers. The secret police thrived on betrayal, turning communities against themselves. Case studies of resistance and Gestapo repression reveal the devastating consequences of this strategy. In France, the capture of resistance leader Jean Moulin crippled efforts to unify underground factions, showing how a single arrest could paralyze an entire movement. In Poland, the discovery of courier networks led to the collapse of underground presses, depriving citizens of news and hope. The White Rose in Germany proved that even small-scale dissent was mercilessly stamped out. In Belgium, the Gestapo's cooperation with collaborators enabled the arrest of resistance leaders, who were executed or deported. In the Netherlands, betrayals allowed the Gestapo to dismantle networks that sheltered Jewish families, leading to mass deportations. Each case revealed a pattern: surveillance, infiltration, arrest, interrogation, and destruction. Resistance was resilient, but its cost was enormous, measured in broken bodies and silenced voices. The Gestapo succeeded in forcing underground fighters to live in a state of constant fear and mistrust. Yet, despite this, resistance endured, proving the human spirit's resilience. The Gestapo could destroy lives, but not extinguish hope entirely. By the mid-war years, the Gestapo had become the most feared enemy of resistance movements across Europe. Its methods, interrogation, infiltration, torture and deportation, were brutally effective, but they required collaboration, betrayal, and an atmosphere of fear to succeed. The Gestapo was rarely numerous, but its reputation magnified its reach, convincing many that it was everywhere. Resistance fighters fought courageously, but the odds were stacked against them, as every action risked exposure. Files filled Gestapo offices with names, addresses, and coded reports, each representing a life under threat. Trains carried captured fighters to camps, where survival was rare. The Gestapo had succeeded in exporting its war against dissent from Germany into every occupied land. Yet the very existence of resistance showed that terror was never absolute. Underground presses, sabotage, and acts of defiance continued despite unimaginable risks. The Gestapo's war on resistance movements revealed both the power of fear and the endurance of courage. In this battle, every act of resistance was a victory against silence. The Gestapo hunted relentlessly, but defiance never entirely died. When Germany plunged Europe into war in 1939, the Gestapo did not remain a police force confined to Germany's borders. Instead, it became a weapon of occupation, deployed across conquered territories to crush resistance, monitor civilian populations, and enforce Nazi racial policy. Counterintelligence became one of its primary tasks, with officers ordered to identify enemy spies, track down resistance couriers, and suppress underground communications. In occupied France, the Gestapo monitored every form of clandestine activity, from smuggled Allied radios to secret newspapers. In the Netherlands and Belgium, networks aiding downed Allied pilots were dismantled with ruthless efficiency. In Poland, where resistance was fiercest, the Gestapo carried out mass arrests of suspected sympathizers, filling prisons and camps with thousands. Counterintelligence operations often blurred with outright terror, as anyone with foreign contacts or unusual correspondence fell under suspicion. The Gestapo claimed to defend German security, but in practice it created a climate of suffocating fear. Every whisper of dissent could be treated as espionage. War expanded the Gestapo's reach from national repression to continental counterintelligence. Their files and prisons filled with those accused of treachery, real or imagined. The Gestapo's counterintelligence operations were closely tied to the Sicherheitsdienst SD, forming a web of surveillance across occupied Europe. The SD gathered intelligence from informants and intercepted communications, while the Gestapo acted on these reports with arrests and interrogations. This collaboration allowed them to dismantle resistance networks with remarkable speed. Allied agents parachuted into Europe often lasted only weeks before being betrayed or captured. The Gestapo cultivated networks of double agents, feeding false information back to British intelligence and misleading resistance movements. In France, the Prosper network, one of the most important SOE circuits, was compromised by Gestapo infiltration, leading to mass arrests and executions. In Belgium, similar operations crippled underground rail sabotage cells. In Denmark and Norway, Allied efforts to supply resistance fighters were constantly undermined by Gestapo surveillance. Counterintelligence was not a sideline but a central weapon of war. By breaking Allied spy networks, the Gestapo hindered sabotage operations and slowed down support for resistance. War sharpened their role from domestic police to continental intelligence enforcers. Fear became their greatest ally in counterintelligence operations. Alongside intelligence work, the Gestapo created special units for frontline and rear area control. Known as Einsatzkommandos or security detachments, these teams followed the Wehrmacht into conquered lands. Their mission was clear: secure occupied territory by eliminating political opponents, suspected spies, and racial enemies. In Poland in 1939, these units carried out mass shootings of intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders, targeting those who might inspire resistance. Similar units accompanied the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, becoming the infamous Einsatzgruppen. Here, the Gestapo's role merged directly with mass murder, as they worked alongside the SS to massacre Jews, communists, and partisans. The presence of Gestapo officers ensured that executions were not chaotic, but documented and reported back to Berlin. These units operated in towns and villages, gathering civilians, conducting interrogations, and carrying out shootings in fields and ravines. The Gestapo's files became death lists, guiding the massacres that followed. The transformation from police to frontline terror unit was complete. Wherever the Wehrmacht advanced, the Gestapo followed. Occupation was immediately paired with annihilation. The link between the Gestapo and the Einsatzgruppen was both operational and ideological. While the Einsatzgruppen were primarily SS units tasked with mass killings, Gestapo officers provided intelligence, identified victims, and ensured bureaucratic oversight. In the Baltic states, Ukraine, and Belarus, Gestapo detachments compiled lists of Jews, communists, and undesirables to be executed. They interrogated local officials, forced confessions, and used files captured from Soviet offices to identify targets. Once lists were complete, Einsatzgruppen carried out mass shootings, often with Gestapo officers observing or participating. In Babi Yar, where over 33,000 Jews were murdered outside Kiev in September 1941, Gestapo operatives were present alongside SS and police units. Reports of such massacres were sent back to RSHA headquarters, couched in bureaucratic terms like special treatment or resettlement. The Gestapo's role was thus not confined to intelligence, but extended into genocide. They ensured that extermination was efficient, organized, and aligned with Berlin's directives. Their presence gave these atrocities an official seal of approval. In the East, the Gestapo became executioners as well as interrogators. Terror was no longer hidden in prisons but carried out in open fields. Rear area control became one of the Gestapo's most important wartime functions. As the Wehrmacht advanced deep into enemy territory, supply lines stretched thin, and the danger of partisan attacks grew. The Gestapo established field offices to suppress these insurgencies, often using collective punishment to deter further resistance. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned, their inhabitants shot or deported. In Yugoslavia, the Gestapo oversaw brutal reprisals in response to guerrilla attacks, where entire communities were executed for the actions of a few fighters. In the Soviet Union, partisan warfare was answered with scorched earth tactics, guided by Gestapo intelligence. Special detachments interrogated captured partisans, torturing them for information on networks and supply routes. The intelligence gained fueled further raids, creating a vicious cycle of resistance and repression. Rear area control was not about security, but about domination, ensuring that no population could rise against German rule. The Gestapo's methods mirrored those used in Germany itself: informants, denunciations, and terror. But here the consequences were magnified by war. Suppression of dissent meant annihilation of communities. The Gestapo's role in occupied Europe was inseparable from the Holocaust. While Einsatzgruppen carried out mass shootings, the Gestapo facilitated deportations to extermination camps. Their officers compiled lists, coordinated with railway officials, and oversaw roundups of Jews and other targeted groups. In many cases, Gestapo units carried out initial mass shootings before shifting to deportation strategies once camps became operational. In Poland, their prisons became holding points for Jews awaiting transport to Auschwitz or Treblinka. In Western Europe, Gestapo officers coordinated with collaborators to arrest Jews and resistance fighters, sending them to camps in Germany. Deportations were presented as administrative tasks, but behind the paperwork lay mass murder. The Gestapo's efficiency made the final solution possible, ensuring that victims were identified, tracked, and delivered to their deaths. The files compiled since the 1930s now served as the blueprint for extermination. Each arrest, each deportation, each train bore their fingerprints. The Gestapo was not merely a participant but a central architect of genocide. War gave them the means to expand persecution into systematic extermination. The Gestapo's war was also a psychological one, aimed at breaking the will of occupied populations. Fear was cultivated deliberately through public executions, random arrests, and collective punishment. In France, posters announced the execution of hostages as reprisal for resistance attacks, each signed by Gestapo authorities. In Poland, mass hangings were staged in town squares to terrify survivors into submission. In the Soviet Union, entire villages were exterminated as warnings to others. Interrogations were designed not only to extract information, but to demonstrate absolute control, leaving prisoners broken and communities fearful. The Gestapo's reputation grew with each act of terror, becoming larger than life. Even those who never saw an officer lived under their shadow, convinced that betrayal or arrest was inevitable. This psychological dominance was as important as physical repression. It ensured that resistance was isolated, underground, and constantly threatened. The Gestapo's war was fought not only with guns and files, but with fear itself. In this invisible battle, they were terrifyingly successful. By the midpoint of the war, the Gestapo had fully transformed into a continental weapon of occupation, counterintelligence, and genocide. From France to the Soviet Union, its presence was felt in every prison, every deportation, and every act of terror. Its special units trailed the Wehrmacht, ensuring that conquest was immediately followed by repression. Its collaboration with the Einsatzgruppen tied it directly to mass shootings that killed millions. Its counterintelligence operations crippled Allied espionage and resistance efforts. Its rear area control made entire communities into hostages of German occupation. War had amplified the Gestapo's role beyond anything envisioned in the 1930s. It was no longer just Hitler's secret police. It was the spearhead of Nazi terror across Europe. The Gestapo's war was fought on every front against Jews, partisans, resistance networks, and entire civilian populations. In every country touched by occupation, its shadow loomed. The Gestapo had become the embodiment of Nazi war itself. Terror and annihilation were its battlefield. Inside Gestapo prisons, interrogation was not a matter of justice but of terror, designed to extract confessions, information, or simply to break the will of those arrested. From the moment prisoners were taken into custody, they entered a carefully constructed system meant to disorient and dominate them. Isolation cells were cold, damp, and lightless, depriving captives of any sense of time or normality. Prisoners were kept awake for days on end, subjected to relentless questioning that blurred night and day. Guards deliberately shifted interrogators to create the illusion of an endless cycle, wearing down even the strongest. Food was withheld or rationed to starvation levels, further weakening resistance. Interrogation rooms were stark, often equipped with tools of pain laid out as silent threats. Prisoners were made to wait for hours, hearing the screams of others, knowing their turn was coming. Fear was cultivated long before the first blow. The Gestapo understood that terror began in the mind. Psychological torment was as important as physical abuse in their system of control. Physical torture was applied with calculated cruelty, designed to maximize suffering while minimizing immediate death. Prisoners were beaten with fists, clubs, and whips, often until unconscious. Victims were suspended by their wrists, arms wrenched painfully behind their backs, leaving joints permanently damaged. Electric shocks were administered using improvised devices, applied to sensitive parts of the body to inflict excruciating pain. Water torture was common, where captives were forcibly submerged until near drowning, then revived for another round. Hot needles were driven under fingernails and boots crushed hands and feet. In some cases, prisoners were forced to kneel for hours on sharp objects, tearing flesh and leaving lasting injuries. Women endured sexual humiliation and assaults that compounded their trauma. Survivors spoke of broken bones, ruptured organs, and disfiguring injuries. Interrogations were rarely intended to kill outright, but to leave victims shattered, physically broken, and incapable of further resistance. The Gestapo perfected the art of sustained agony. Torture was their signature, the mark of their authority. Psychological torture was perhaps even more devastating than physical brutality. Prisoners were threatened with execution, not only for themselves, but for their families. Many were told their loved ones had already been arrested, and sometimes this was true. Captives were forced to listen to the screams of others being tortured, their imaginations magnifying their own impending suffering. Sleep deprivation created hallucinations and confusion, making resistance almost impossible. Interrogators used lies and forged documents to convince prisoners that comrades had betrayed them. They exploited guilt, shame, and fear, playing on the human need to protect others. Some captives were forced to watch executions, or to clean up after torture sessions, deepening their psychological wounds. The aim was not just to gain information, but to utterly destroy morale. Prisoners left interrogation rooms not only in pain but in despair. The Gestapo institutionalized fear as a weapon, knowing that a broken mind was more effective than a beaten body. Terror was a science they perfected. Famous cases illuminate the methods the Gestapo employed. In France, resistance leader Jean Moulin was tortured mercilessly after his arrest in 1943. Beaten until unrecognizable, he never revealed his comrades and eventually died under Gestapo custody. In Germany, the student activists of the White Rose, including Sophie and Hans Scholl, were subjected to brutal interrogations before their rapid execution. In Poland, captured members of the Home Army faced weeks of torture in Gestapo prisons, their names often appearing in files only after their deaths. Survivors recalled the infamous prisons at Avenue Foch in Paris, Pawiak in Warsaw, and Prinz Albrecht Straße in Berlin as places where screams echoed endlessly. Each prison developed a reputation so dreadful that its very mention spread terror. These cases revealed not only the cruelty of the methods, but also the determination of some prisoners to resist even under unimaginable suffering. The Gestapo's brutality was matched only by the courage of those who endured it. Yet for most, survival came at the cost of scars, visible and invisible. Torture left permanent shadows on lives and communities. Institutionalized fear was maintained not only through torture itself, but through the uncertainty surrounding it. Prisoners never knew when they would be called, how long an interrogation would last, or whether they would return alive. Random beatings in cells, sudden executions, and deliberate displays of cruelty reinforced the sense of helplessness. Interrogators deliberately alternated between violence and false kindness, offering food or comfort one moment, then resuming brutality the next. This unpredictability broke down psychological defenses, leaving captives vulnerable. Survivors often spoke of the dread before interrogation as worse than the pain itself. The Gestapo mastered the art of anticipation, weaponizing fear of the unknown. Even those who had not yet been tortured lived in constant terror, knowing their turn would come. This atmosphere extended beyond prisons, as civilians whispered of the horrors within Gestapo cellars. The secrecy surrounding interrogations magnified their power. Rumor and fear amplified reality until the Gestapo seemed omnipotent. Terror was not limited to victims, but spread through entire populations. The Gestapo's interrogation system relied heavily on bureaucratic precision. Every session was documented, every confession filed, every broken body reduced to a report. Files contained signatures, dates, and neatly typed summaries of information extracted under duress. This paperwork gave torture a veneer of legality, transforming brutality into procedure. Interrogators saw themselves not as sadists, but as officials carrying out necessary tasks for state security. The bureaucratic culture shielded individuals from moral responsibility, making cruelty appear routine. Victims became case numbers, their humanity erased in the sterile language of forms. Confessions obtained under torture were often used to justify further arrests, creating self-reinforcing cycles of repression. Torture was not the chaotic act of rogue officers, but an institutionalized tool of governance. The Gestapo systematized brutality, making it as much a part of their operations as files and typewriters. In this way, cruelty became normalized, woven into the very structure of the state. Paper and pain were inseparable in Gestapo offices. Terror was codified into bureaucracy. Survivor accounts testify to the lasting scars of Gestapo torture. Many spoke of shattered bones that never healed, or of permanent disabilities caused by their injuries. Others carried deep psychological trauma, haunted by nightmares and flashbacks, for the rest of their lives. Some felt crushing guilt for information they had revealed under duress, believing they had betrayed comrades or endangered families. Testimonies after the war revealed not only the pain inflicted, but also the extraordinary resilience of those who endured. Survivors described small acts of defiance, refusing to speak, enduring beatings without confession, or protecting comrades by taking blame. These stories remind us that even in the depths of terror, human dignity could survive. Yet for countless others, the Gestapo's methods succeeded in silencing opposition. Torture broke bodies, destroyed networks, and spread fear through every layer of society. Survivor voices serve as living indictments of a system built on cruelty. They reveal both the cost of repression and the strength of resistance. Each testimony stands as evidence of institutional evil. By institutionalizing torture, the Gestapo turned fear into a weapon of mass control. Their methods combined psychological manipulation, physical brutality, and bureaucratic efficiency to create a system that was both terrifying and predictable. Every arrest carried with it the threat of interrogation, and every interrogation carried the likelihood of pain. This knowledge kept entire populations subdued, ensuring compliance through anticipation alone. The Gestapo proved that terror did not need to be universal to be effective. It needed only to be certain for a few and possible for everyone. Torture became both a method of interrogation and a tool of governance. It created silence where words might have been spoken, obedience where defiance might have arisen. The Gestapo's techniques embodied the darkest fusion of ideology and administration, where cruelty was not an aberration but a policy. By making fear systemic, they ensured that it endured beyond the walls of their prisons. Entire societies learned to live with silence as survival. In the machinery of Nazi rule, torture was not excess, it was design. As the war dragged on and German manpower dwindled, the Nazi state turned increasingly to foreign labor to sustain its war machine. Millions of men and women from occupied countries were brought to Germany, often through coercion or outright deportation. They were assigned to factories, farms, and construction sites, expected to fuel the Reich's industry with their sweat and exhaustion. Yet their presence in the heart of Germany was not seen as an asset alone. It was treated as a potential threat. The Gestapo was charged with monitoring this vast population, ensuring compliance, discipline, and absolute subservience. Every factory with foreign workers had informants reporting to local Gestapo offices. Suspicion of sabotage, slow work, or even minor defiance could bring swift punishment. The Gestapo regarded foreign laborers not as humans but as exploitable resources to be controlled through fear. Their mission was not productivity alone, but obedience through terror. In this way, the Gestapo became the overseer of an invisible army of slaves. Fear was the whip that kept them moving. Foreign workers came from across occupied Europe, with large numbers from Poland, the Soviet Union, and other Eastern territories. These laborers were treated as racially inferior, segregated from German society, and subjected to humiliating restrictions. They were often forced to wear identifying badges, such as the infamous OST patch for Eastern workers, marking them as outsiders. Social contact with Germans, particularly romantic relations, was forbidden and punished severely. Living conditions were appalling: overcrowded barracks, insufficient food, and rampant disease. The Gestapo kept close watch on these camps, using sudden inspections and harsh interrogations to enforce discipline. Rumors of sabotage or disobedience were enough to bring raids, arrests, and deportations to concentration camps. Foreign laborers lived in a climate of constant surveillance, where a careless word or an act of resistance could mean death. They were trapped between exhausting labor and the terror of the Gestapo. Their suffering was woven into the fabric of the Nazi war economy. Each day was a battle for survival, under watchful eyes. The Gestapo developed elaborate systems to punish so-called defiant or lazy workers. Minor infractions such as slowing production, taking extra food, or failing to meet quotas were labeled sabotage. Workers accused of such behavior were often beaten publicly, both to punish and to terrify others. Some were sent to special labor education camps, where conditions were even more brutal than in their workplaces. These camps became places of starvation, beatings, and overwork designed to break spirits. For many, a transfer to one of these camps was a death sentence. Others were summarily executed as examples, their deaths intended to keep thousands obedient. The Gestapo framed these punishments as necessary to protect the German war effort. In reality, they were acts of systemic terror, reinforcing Nazi racial hierarchy while exploiting human beings to the brink of collapse. Punishment was never proportional, it was always excessive, calculated to spread fear. For foreign workers, labor was not employment, but a form of imprisonment without bars. Their overseer was not a foreman but the secret police. Deportations were a constant threat hanging over the forced labor population. The Gestapo had the authority to remove any uncooperative worker from a factory or camp and send them to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, or Ravensbrück. Once transferred, survival chances diminished drastically, as camp labor was harsher and punishments more lethal. Deportations were often carried out without trial, based solely on suspicion or denunciation. In some cases, entire groups of workers were deported after acts of sabotage or resistance, punished collectively for the deeds of a few. Families of workers in occupied territories were also targeted, creating an atmosphere of helplessness and despair. Deportation was both punishment and warning, ensuring that others complied out of fear. The Gestapo used this tool with ruthless regularity, treating people as disposable assets. A laborer's worth was measured in hours worked and obedience shown. Once that worth was questioned, the Gestapo erased it. For countless workers, deportation meant the transition from slavery to extermination. The Gestapo's role extended beyond discipline to the active hunting of escapees and resistors among laborers. Many workers attempted to flee, hoping to return home or join resistance movements. The Gestapo mobilized patrols, informants, and even German civilians to track them down. Posters announcing rewards for captures appeared across cities, reinforcing the sense of constant surveillance. Those recaptured were tortured, executed, or paraded before fellow workers as examples. Escape attempts were treated not as acts of desperation, but as sabotage against the Reich. Resistance cells formed secretly among laborers, often planning strikes or small acts of sabotage, but the Gestapo crushed these efforts with brutal efficiency. In Poland and France, networks that aided laborers in escaping were infiltrated and dismantled by Gestapo agents. Fear of betrayal kept many from even attempting flight. The Gestapo's relentless pursuit reminded laborers that there was no safety beyond their barracks. The Reich's grip extended into every corner of their lives. Hope itself became a dangerous act. The use of fear was not limited to physical punishment. The Gestapo institutionalized humiliation as a tool of control. Workers were paraded before their peers, mocked and degraded for failing to meet expectations. Public punishments were staged deliberately to break morale and to remind others of their powerlessness. Some workers were forced to wear placards labeling them as shirkers or saboteurs, turning punishment into spectacle. This humiliation reinforced racial hierarchy, reducing Eastern laborers to a status below even that of prisoners. The Gestapo wanted laborers to internalize their subjugation, to believe that resistance was futile and dignity unattainable. By making punishment public, they ensured that terror spread beyond the individual to the entire group. Fear was magnified, becoming a shared burden among workers. The line between punishment and propaganda blurred, as the Gestapo used brutality to stage lessons in obedience. In this way, forced labor was not only exploitation but indoctrination into silence. The Gestapo ensured that despair replaced defiance. Terror became the rhythm of work. Survivor testimonies after the war revealed the full scale of suffering inflicted on foreign laborers under Gestapo oversight. Workers described endless hours in factories, collapsing from exhaustion, only to be beaten back onto their feet. Women recalled sexual violence and exploitation by guards and overseers, with the Gestapo ignoring or even encouraging such abuse as part of domination. Many spoke of comrades executed for trifles, stealing bread, pausing work, or attempting contact with Germans. Prisoners transferred to camps remembered the terror of their first interrogations, where Gestapo officers demanded obedience through brutality. The stories revealed that survival depended on silence, submission, and luck. Families torn apart by deportations, often never reunited. For those who endured, scars, physical and psychological, remained for life. Testimonies underscored that forced labor was not merely economic exploitation, but systematic dehumanization. The Gestapo's presence ensured that workers lived not only as slaves, but as prisoners in an open-air camp. Their voices, recovered after the war, testify to the reach of Gestapo terror. Each account revealed the cost of labor under dictatorship. By overseeing forced labor, the Gestapo extended its reach from political policing into the very core of Germany's wartime economy. Factories, farms, and mines became extensions of its prison cells, with terror functioning as the engine of productivity. The Gestapo ensured that the Reich's war machine was fueled by fear, not efficiency, using brutality to maintain order among millions who had no choice. Their system demonstrated how ideology and exploitation merged. Racial contempt justified enslavement, and enslavement fed the war effort. Deportations and executions became routine tools of labor management. The Gestapo reduced human beings to expendable parts in a vast machinery of war, discarded when they faltered. Fear was institutionalized, ensuring that obedience could be maintained without endless manpower. The system was efficient, not because it was productive, but because it destroyed the possibility of defiance. Forced labor under the Gestapo was both a crime against humanity and a pillar of the Nazi state. It revealed how terror could be industrialized, and it showed that even work itself could be weaponized into suffering. The Gestapo's image during the Nazi era was one of an all-seeing, all-knowing force, capable of uncovering any act of disloyalty. German propaganda deliberately cultivated this myth, portraying the secret police as a shadowy network with tentacles in every home, school, and workplace. Posters, speeches, and films suggested that no whisper was safe, no closed door could conceal dissent. People came to believe that every letter was intercepted, every conversation overheard, and every act of disobedience known instantly to Berlin. This belief created a society paralyzed by fear, where silence became a survival strategy. But in reality, the Gestapo was far smaller and less omnipresent than its reputation suggested. At its peak, the organization employed only tens of thousands of officers to oversee a population of millions across Germany and occupied Europe. The numbers made true surveillance of everyone impossible. Instead, the Gestapo amplified its reach through fear and rumor, making people censor themselves. The myth was as powerful as any reality. By convincing Germans they were always watched, the Gestapo ensured they rarely had to be. The actual manpower of the Gestapo reveals the limits of its reach. In major German cities, Local offices often had only a handful of officers responsible for tens of thousands of residents. In Berlin, for instance, one officer might oversee an entire district of hundreds of thousands. This disparity meant that constant surveillance was unachievable. Files piled up, cases were delayed, and real investigations often began only when denunciations or tips arrived. Contrary to the myth, the Gestapo did not have agents lurking on every corner or spies planted in every neighborhood. Instead, it used selective terror to create the impression of ubiquity. When a dissenter was suddenly arrested, interrogated, or disappeared, the shockwave spread far beyond the individual case. Families, friends, and colleagues witnessed the consequences, reinforcing the illusion that no act escaped attention. In this way, manpower shortages were compensated by psychological manipulation. Fear filled the gaps that officers could not. The Gestapo's strength lay less in numbers than in perception. Denunciations from ordinary citizens became the true backbone of the Gestapo's operations. The files of the secret police, examined after the war, revealed that most investigations began with reports from neighbors, co-workers, or even family members. A suspicious comment, a careless joke, or an act of defiance often reached the Gestapo not through surveillance but through betrayal. Some denunciations were motivated by loyalty to the regime, but many stemmed from personal grievances, jealousies, rivalries, or disputes over property. The Gestapo encouraged this behavior, providing channels for anonymous tips and rewarding informants with protection or favors. As a result, society itself became a web of surveillance, with ordinary Germans policing one another. The Gestapo did not need to monitor every home because homes monitored themselves. This culture of betrayal eroded trust, ensuring that dissent was stifled before it could grow. Fear of denunciation was as effective as fear of the Gestapo itself. In truth, the people became the secret police. The Gestapo merely organized and exploited their suspicions. Propaganda, however, masked this reliance on ordinary citizens, presenting the Gestapo as a powerful, centralized machine. Newspapers carried stories of miraculous arrests, where criminals or traitors were allegedly caught through sophisticated surveillance. Films and novels exaggerated the reach of the secret police, portraying them as masters of disguise and strategy. This portrayal suited the Nazi regime, for it discouraged opposition by making resistance appear hopeless. Even minor infractions seemed likely to be uncovered by an all-knowing state. The truth that most cases arose from neighborly denunciations remained hidden behind layers of secrecy. Germans came to assume that the Gestapo possessed advanced listening devices, vast networks of agents, and endless resources. The aura of mystery magnified their power beyond measure. Propaganda transformed weakness into strength, concealment into omniscience. In this way, the myth reinforced itself, leaving Germans trapped in a prison of perception. Belief in Gestapo omnipotence was enough to enforce conformity. The lie became as effective as the truth. The myth of omniscience also served an important psychological function. By convincing people that resistance was futile, the Gestapo minimized the need for constant repression. Fear made Germans preemptively censor themselves, avoiding conversations, gatherings, or actions that might be deemed suspicious. Families warned children not to repeat what was said at home, lest teachers report them. Workers avoided discussing politics, fearing informants at factories. Churches tread carefully, knowing sermons could be misinterpreted. Even friendships dissolved under the weight of distrust, as individuals distanced themselves from potential risks. This climate of silence spread faster than any officer could enforce. The Gestapo had weaponized imagination, turning citizens into prisoners of their own minds. In many ways, the perception of constant surveillance was more effective than surveillance itself. It created a society where freedom of thought still existed, but freedom of speech had vanished. Germans lived in a reality shaped by fear. Even when the Gestapo was absent, terror became internalized, and the myth did the work of armies. Yet despite its reliance on denunciations, the Gestapo's brutality was very real. Once reports reached their desks, officers investigated with ruthless efficiency. Suspects were summoned, interrogated, and often tortured until confessions were obtained. Files were updated with damning evidence, whether true or fabricated, and sentences carried out swiftly. Even if most Germans never faced interrogation themselves, stories of those who did spread quickly. These tales reinforced the idea that no one was safe, that the Gestapo's reach was limitless. Survivors who emerged from prison bore the scars of torture, living testimonies to the cost of defiance. Rumors of executions, disappearances, and deportations circulated widely, keeping fear alive. In this sense, the Gestapo needed only to make examples of a few to control the many. Terror was economical, applied selectively but with devastating effect. The myth of omnipotence was sustained by the reality of cruelty. Each case became a warning to thousands. Each warning multiplied fear. Historians after the war have worked to dismantle the myth and reveal the realities of Gestapo power. They have shown that the organization's efficiency was overstated, its numbers limited, and its reliance on citizen participation overwhelming. The Gestapo was feared not because it was everywhere, but because people believed it was. This belief stemmed from both propaganda and the visible consequences of repression. Files uncovered revealed that the majority of Germans had little direct contact with the Gestapo, yet their lives were shaped by fear of it. The myth endured partly because survivors, in recalling their terror, reinforced the image of an all-seeing force. But careful study demonstrates the fragility of that image. The Gestapo was not omnipotent. It was opportunistic. It thrived on fear, betrayal, and selective violence rather than total surveillance. Its power was psychological as much as it was physical. The myth lingers because terror leaves deep scars, long after the machinery that created it is gone. The Gestapo's legacy, therefore, lies in the dangerous fusion of myth and reality. Its actual size was small, its resources limited, and its reach far from universal. Yet through propaganda, denunciations, and selective brutality, it convinced a nation that it was all-powerful. Germans policed themselves, silenced one another, and lived in dread of discovery. The reality was a patchwork of files, informants, and officers stretched thin across an empire. But the myth created obedience without the need for constant enforcement. This duality explains why the Gestapo remains one of history's most feared secret police forces. It reminds us that terror does not require absolute strength, only the perception of it. Fear can magnify limited power into omnipotence, and once a society believes it is always watched, resistance collapses before it begins. In Nazi Germany, the Gestapo's greatest weapon was not its numbers but its myth. The illusion of omniscience became its true reality. By 1944, the Nazi Empire was crumbling under the combined weight of Allied advances from the West and Soviet offensives from the East. Yet rather than loosening its grip, the Gestapo tightened its hold, determined to crush dissent within Germany as the military situation deteriorated. The leadership believed that defeat was being accelerated by internal weakness, defeatism, and treason. As bombs destroyed cities and refugees flooded the Reich, Gestapo officers hunted for scapegoats, punishing anyone suspected of spreading defeatist talk. Whispered doubts about Hitler's leadership or the course of the war could be reported and swiftly punished. Propaganda painted loyalty as the last duty of every German, and the Gestapo was tasked with enforcing this loyalty by any means necessary. Suspects were arrested, tortured, and executed with growing frequency. The chaos of war provided both the excuse and the opportunity for arbitrary brutality. To the Gestapo, every failure at the front had a domestic counterpart that needed eliminating. In their eyes, terror was the only way to maintain discipline. The collapse of the Reich was mirrored by the intensification of its police terror. The Gestapo expanded its campaign against deserters and draft evaders, seeing them as traitors to the nation in its hour of need. Military tribunals and field courts condemned thousands of German soldiers for desertion in the final months of the war. The Gestapo played a central role in hunting these men down, combing railway stations, city streets, and refugee columns for anyone lacking proper papers. Patrols swept through bombed-out neighborhoods, checking documents and seizing anyone suspected of shirking duty. Desertion was equated with sabotage, and punishments were swift and merciless. Many were executed on the spot, often before demoralized comrades as warnings. Posters appeared across cities announcing death sentences for deserters and cowards. Entire families of deserters sometimes suffered arrests and imprisonment, accused of complicity. The Gestapo's relentless pursuit of these men reflected the regime's desperation. With the front collapsing, manpower dwindling, and defeat looming, loyalty was demanded at gunpoint. In the twilight of the Reich, executions became a grim form of propaganda. Terror replaced strategy as the final weapon of control. Civilian dissent was treated with equal ruthlessness. Workers who complained about ration shortages, civilians who listened to foreign radio, or neighbors who expressed doubts about victory could all be denounced to the Gestapo. With cities reduced to rubble and food scarce, despair was widespread, but expression of despair was criminalized. The Gestapo labeled such voices as undermining the war effort, a capital offense in the last phase of Nazi rule. Special courts worked in tandem with Gestapo officers to expedite trials, often lasting only minutes before sentencing. Executions multiplied as the leadership tried to terrify the population into silence. The People's Court under Roland Freisler became infamous for show trials where shouting replaced justice, and the Gestapo provided the evidence. Prison populations swelled with Germans, who only months earlier had been considered loyal. Even small acts, like making jokes about Hitler or grumbling about air raids, could bring arrest and death. The Gestapo transformed despair into treason. In the ruins of Germany, fear was imposed more harshly than ever. The regime collapsed, but its terror machinery only accelerated. One of the Gestapo's most notorious roles in the war's final year was its repression of resistance within Germany itself. After the failed July 20th, 1944, plot to assassinate Hitler, the Gestapo unleashed a wave of arrests and executions. Thousands of military officers, civil servants, and ordinary citizens were rounded up, tortured, and often executed. The conspirators were hanged with piano wire in slow, agonizing deaths, filmed for Hitler's amusement. The Gestapo dismantled entire networks of opposition, from aristocratic officers to student groups. Family members of conspirators were targeted under the policy of Sippenhaft or kin liability, ensuring that wives and children paid the price for their relatives' actions. Interrogations grew even more brutal as officers sought to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy. Fear spread through the army and bureaucracy, silencing even those who still despised the regime. The July plot gave the Gestapo the excuse to eliminate any lingering opposition under the guise of treason. Even in the face of total defeat, the Gestapo treated resistance as the greatest danger. Loyalty to Hitler, not victory, became their obsession. Executions surged across Germany as the Reich neared its end. Public hangings were staged in town squares to terrify civilians into obedience. Gestapo officers often organized these spectacles, forcing citizens to witness the deaths of their neighbors. Prisoners were displayed with signs labeling them as traitors, deserters, or cowards, transforming executions into propaganda events. In some cities, gallows were permanently erected, ready for use whenever another victim was chosen. Even as Allied armies closed in, the Gestapo prioritized terror over survival. Thousands of prisoners were executed in the final weeks of the war, sometimes within days or hours of liberation. The Dachau Death March, for example, saw thousands of emaciated prisoners forced westward, with stragglers shot by Gestapo guards. In Berlin, mass executions continued until the very eve of Soviet entry. The Gestapo's commitment to terror never faltered, even as the regime's death was inevitable. Their final acts were not of defense, but of murder. The end of the Reich was drenched in blood spilled by its own police. The Gestapo also turned its fury against foreign laborers and concentration camp prisoners as the war drew to a close. As Allied forces advanced, prisoners were forced on death marches across Germany, guarded by Gestapo men who executed those too weak to continue. Laborers suspected of defiance were shot outright, their deaths hidden amidst the chaos of collapse. Camps were liquidated in a frenzy of killings designed to erase evidence of atrocities. The Gestapo oversaw the destruction of records, the burning of files, and the silencing of witnesses. Yet the scale of the crimes was too vast to conceal. Survivors staggered into Allied lines, telling of the horrors they had endured. Abandoned prisons revealed cells filled with corpses, and hastily dug mass graves betrayed the scale of slaughter. The Gestapo's desperation to cover its crimes only added to its brutality. In their final months, they committed some of their worst atrocities. The collapse of the Reich brought no mercy to its victims. Instead, it brought an escalation of terror. In the final battles, the Gestapo's role shifted from surveillance to execution squads. As Soviet troops closed on Berlin, special units roamed the city, executing suspected deserters and defeatists. Civilians caught without papers, men fleeing the front, or anyone accused of sabotage were shot in the streets. The chaos of collapse gave the Gestapo free rein to kill without restraint. Summary executions were carried out under martial law, with no trial or pretense of legality. Officers patrolled ruined neighborhoods, their authority backed by desperation rather than law. Terror became random, striking anyone unlucky enough to be accused. Even as bombs rained down, and the Red Army entered the suburbs, the Gestapo continued to hunt its own people. Their loyalty to the Führer was measured in corpses, not victories. In Berlin's final days, thousands were executed in basements, courtyards, and makeshift gallows. The Gestapo's last contribution to the Reich was not defense but slaughter. The city's ruins became graveyards for its own citizens. The end of the Reich revealed the Gestapo for what it truly was, a machine of terror sustained until its final breath. Even as defeat became undeniable, they intensified repression, executing deserters, dissenters, and innocents with fanatical determination. The myth of omnipotence collapsed with the regime, but the reality of their violence was undeniable. They had not saved Germany. They had destroyed it from within. In their final acts, the Gestapo left behind not loyalty or order but corpses and ashes. The very people they claimed to protect became their last victims. Fear, their greatest weapon, consumed them in the end, as chaos replaced control. When Allied forces entered German cities, they found a people not only defeated but broken by their own police. The Gestapo's final legacy was terror unleashed in desperation. Their fall marked the end of one of history's most feared institutions. but the scars they left would endure long after their offices were abandoned. As Allied armies swept into the heart of Germany in 1945, they stumbled upon the physical remnants of the Gestapo's reign of terror. Offices were abandoned in haste, files left behind in confusion, and prison cells opened to reveal the full horror of Nazi repression. In Cologne, Frankfurt, and Munich, the Allies found chambers where torture had been routine, their walls etched with prisoners' desperate carvings. Bloodstains, shackles, and crude implements testified to what survivors had long whispered. Filing cabinets overflowed with reports of denunciations, confessions, and execution orders. The scale of paperwork was staggering, an entire machinery of repression preserved in folders and stamps. Each document was chillingly banal, reducing human lives to bureaucratic entries. For Allied soldiers accustomed to combat, these discoveries carried a different weight. Here was cruelty not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the city, against defenseless civilians. The Gestapo's terror had been hidden in plain sight. Now it stood revealed in every abandoned desk and prison cell. The myth of secrecy collapsed into undeniable evidence. Survivors emerged from Gestapo prisons with stories that confirmed the material evidence. Starved, emaciated, and traumatized, they spoke of endless interrogations, torture chambers, and executions carried out without trial. Many could barely stand, their bodies broken by months or years of abuse. Some prisoners were discovered only hours from death, abandoned when their captors fled. Others pointed to mass graves in nearby forests, where comrades had been shot in the final days of the Reich. Survivors' testimonies painted vivid pictures of cruelty, the beatings, the sleep deprivation, the humiliation designed to crush spirit as much as body. Their words gave voice to the countless who had not survived, ensuring that silence did not become their only legacy. Allied interrogators recorded these accounts, stunned by the consistency of the stories across different cities and camps. What emerged was a portrait of systematic brutality, not isolated acts. The Gestapo had been exposed as an institution built on cruelty. Survivors became living proof of its crimes. Their voices echoed through the rubble of a fallen Reich. Allied reactions to these discoveries were marked by shock, outrage, and revulsion. Soldiers who had braved years of combat admitted that nothing prepared them for the atrocities uncovered in Gestapo prisons. American, British, and Soviet officers documented torture chambers with photographs, ensuring that the evidence could not be denied. Journalists accompanied troops, publishing reports that spread horror around the world. Civilians in liberated German towns were often forced to tour the sites, confronted with the evidence of what had been done in their name. Many claimed ignorance, insisting they had never known what went on behind closed doors. But the walls of cells, the cries of survivors, and the endless paperwork contradicted such claims. The Allies wanted Germans to see the machinery of terror firsthand, stripping away the myths of ignorance and innocence. The shock was not only for the world, but for the German people themselves. The Gestapo's brutality could no longer be dismissed as rumor or propaganda. Its legacy of torture had become undeniable. Liberation revealed not only freedom, but truth. Files seized from Gestapo offices became critical evidence in the immediate reckoning. They contained lists of prisoners, records of interrogations, and execution orders signed by officers. Each folder exposed how bureaucracy had cloaked brutality in paperwork. Investigators pieced together networks of informants, chains of command, and the scale of persecution across Germany and occupied Europe. What shocked many was the ordinariness of the documents: forms stamped, signatures scrawled, reports typed with clinical detachment. These papers revealed that terror had been normalized, reduced to office routine. For Allied prosecutors, the files were invaluable, providing names, dates, and procedures that survivors' testimonies alone could not establish. The Gestapo's obsession with documentation became its undoing, as its meticulous records condemned its officers. Evidence of crimes was not hidden, but filed neatly in cabinets. The banality of evil was visible in every sheet of paper. Bureaucracy had been both the engine and the mask of terror. Now it became the blueprint for justice. Immediate trials began even before the grand proceedings at Nuremberg. Local Gestapo officials captured in liberated areas were often tried swiftly by military courts. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, collaborators and Gestapo agents were executed after rapid proceedings. In Germany itself, Allied military tribunals worked to punish those most directly involved in torture and executions. Some officers attempted to claim they were merely following orders, but the scale of brutality left little room for sympathy. Others fled or disguised themselves, hoping to disappear into the chaos of occupied Germany. Yet many were captured thanks to surviving prisoners who identified their tormentors. The urgency of post-war justice reflected both outrage and necessity. The Allies wanted to ensure that Gestapo crimes were not forgotten in the chaos of reconstruction. Early trials set a precedent. Those who enforced terror would face consequences. The reckoning began even before the full horror of the Holocaust was understood. Justice, however imperfect, moved swiftly against the most visible perpetrators. Survivor testimonies formed the emotional core of these trials, giving voice to the voiceless. Men and women described in harrowing detail the methods of torture, the humiliation, and the fear they had endured. Their words carried weight not only for the court, but for history, transforming abstract charges into human suffering. Judges and prosecutors wept openly at some accounts, while others struggled to maintain composure. Survivors spoke not only for themselves, but for the thousands who had perished in cells, shot in fields, or silenced forever. Their presence shattered any remaining myths about Gestapo professionalism or necessity. Each testimony exposed the reality. Cruelty was the institution's defining feature. Newspapers carried excerpts of these statements, shocking global audiences. In courtrooms and public squares, the Gestapo was condemned not only legally but morally. The survivors' courage ensured that history recorded both the crimes and the voices of the victims. Testimony became both evidence and memorial. Justice carried the weight of remembrance. Despite the trials, many Gestapo officials escaped justice, blending into post-war chaos. Some destroyed files and identities, reinventing themselves as ordinary civilians. Others were captured by Soviet forces and disappeared into gulags, their fates unknown. A significant number evaded prosecution entirely, protected by the sheer scale of post-war displacement and the Allies' focus on rebuilding. Yet the shadow of reckoning remained. Those who were caught faced harsh sentences, ranging from long prison terms to execution. The Nuremberg trials soon expanded accountability, placing the Gestapo itself on trial as a criminal organization. This declaration ensured that membership in the Gestapo carried automatic suspicion and guilt. Even those who escaped justice could never fully escape the stain of their past. The Allies had branded the Gestapo as criminal in its entirety. Liberation had not only freed prisoners, but condemned the system that enslaved them. Reckoning was imperfect, but its message was clear. The Gestapo's crimes would not be forgotten. The liberation of Gestapo prisons and the reckoning that followed revealed the true nature of Nazi terror. No longer shrouded in secrecy or myth, the institution stood exposed as a machinery of cruelty sustained by bureaucracy and fear. The Allies documented its crimes meticulously, ensuring that history would not forget. Survivors spoke with bravery, their testimonies transforming pain into evidence and memory. Trials delivered justice to some, though many perpetrators slipped through the cracks of history. Yet the overall verdict was undeniable. The Gestapo had been an instrument of systematic evil. Its offices, once symbols of fear, became ruins haunted by the memory of screams. Its files, once tools of oppression, became proof of its criminality. Liberation was not only the collapse of tyranny, but the revelation of truth. The reckoning ensured that the Gestapo's name would forever be synonymous with terror. In the ashes of the Reich, justice began its long work. Memory became the ultimate weapon against forgetting. When the International Military Tribunal convened in Nuremberg in late 1945, the Gestapo was placed in the dock not merely as a collection of individuals, but as an entire institution accused of criminality. Prosecutors argued that the organization had been instrumental in planning, executing, and enforcing crimes against humanity across Europe. Evidence drawn from captured files, survivor testimonies, and the testimony of former officers laid bare its role in mass deportations, torture, executions, and the suppression of resistance. Unlike ordinary criminal trials, this was a trial of an entire apparatus of state terror. The prosecution insisted that membership in the Gestapo itself was proof of complicity in criminal activity. Never before had a modern state secret police been judged as an organization rather than just its agents. The Nuremberg judges confronted a new legal frontier. Could a bureaucracy be declared guilty in its entirety? The Gestapo's name, already infamous, was now on trial before the world. Its fate would set a precedent for how humanity judged systems of repression. The eyes of history were fixed on the dock. The verdict would resonate far beyond 1946. The evidence against the Gestapo was overwhelming, a damning portrait of systematic terror. Prosecutors detailed how Gestapo officers directed deportations of Jews, hunted resistance fighters, and enforced policies of racial persecution. Files revealed meticulous records of torture sessions, prison interrogations, and executions carried out without trial. Witnesses testified about their treatment in Gestapo prisons, recounting horrors that confirmed every line of documentation. The organization's integration into the SS and RSHA demonstrated its centrality in Nazi terror, not a rogue element but a pillar of state policy. Interrogations showed that officers often acted not out of compulsion but with ideological conviction, taking pride in their efficiency. The myth of reluctant servants following orders crumbled under the weight of evidence. The Gestapo had not merely enforced laws, it had created and interpreted them to suit its purpose. Its authority extended across occupied Europe, leaving trails of blood wherever it operated. The tribunal listened, horrified yet resolute. The Gestapo was revealed not as a police force, but as a machinery of organized crime. Its guilt was undeniable. In October 1946, the tribunal declared the Gestapo a criminal organization. This designation meant that all its members were presumptively guilty, unless they could prove coercion or lack of knowledge. For the first time, international law branded an entire institution as inherently criminal, setting a precedent for future accountability. Yet this sweeping judgment raised immediate questions about implementation. With hundreds of thousands of former Gestapo members scattered across Germany, how could justice be applied? The Allies faced a monumental task of sorting through individuals, distinguishing zealots from clerks, sadists from file keepers. In principle, the Nuremberg verdict condemned them all. In practice, the complexity of post-war Europe limited the scope of justice. The declaration carried immense symbolic weight but uneven practical consequences. It branded the Gestapo with permanent infamy. Yet for many survivors, justice felt incomplete. The organization was condemned, but countless individuals escaped punishment. The gap between verdict and reality became one of history's haunting contradictions. Some leading Gestapo officers did face trial and execution. Figures like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA under which the Gestapo operated, were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms, their crimes meticulously documented in court. Yet many mid-level officers managed to avoid severe punishment. They blended into the chaos of post-war Germany, disguising their pasts or claiming minor roles. The sheer number of former Gestapo men overwhelmed Allied tribunals, forcing compromises. Trials focused on the most notorious cases, leaving thousands unprosecuted. Even those convicted sometimes served reduced sentences, released in the 1950s as political priorities shifted toward rebuilding Germany in the Cold War. Survivors watched with bitterness as men who had tortured them returned quietly to civilian life. The fate of leading officers highlighted both the successes and the failures of post-war justice. The top echelon paid a heavy price, but the rank and file often slipped through the cracks of history. Justice was partial, uneven, and incomplete. Denazification, the Allied program designed to purge Nazi influence, also revealed the limits of accountability. Former Gestapo officers were required to undergo screenings, where they were classified from major offenders to nominal followers. But the process quickly became overwhelmed by the sheer volume of cases. Millions of Germans were subject to review. With the onset of the Cold War, priorities shifted from punishing past crimes to stabilizing the new West German state. Many former Gestapo officials presented themselves as low-level clerks, claiming ignorance of atrocities. Some provided useful intelligence against the Soviet Union, making them valuable to Allied occupation authorities. Others quietly reintegrated into administrative or police roles in post-war Germany. The machinery of terror had been condemned, but its human operators were often absorbed back into society. Survivors and historians alike would later lament these loopholes. Denazification had punished some, but allowed too many to escape. Justice was compromised by politics, pragmatism, and fatigue. The Gestapo's shadow remained embedded in post-war structures. The Soviet Union took a far harsher approach, capturing and trying Gestapo officials in their zones of occupation. Many were sentenced to long terms in labor camps, with some executed outright. The Soviets publicized these trials as proof of their commitment to punishing fascism. Yet even here, justice was often more political than legal, with confessions extracted under duress and trials serving propaganda goals. In Eastern Europe, collaborators with the Gestapo were hunted and punished severely. Meanwhile, in the West, the urgency of reconstruction meant that many Gestapo members avoided scrutiny altogether. This division reflected the emerging Cold War. One side sought harsh retribution, the other sought rapid reintegration. The contrast created uneven legacies across Europe. Some perpetrators vanished into gulags, while others returned to ordinary lives in West Germany. The Gestapo's reckoning became fragmented, shaped by geopolitics rather than universal principle. Justice was as divided as the continent itself. The organization was condemned, but its members faced radically different fates depending on where they fell. Over time, the memory of the Gestapo's crimes grew even as legal accountability receded. Trials in the 1960s and 1970s occasionally revisited cases, bringing long-hidden perpetrators back into court. Survivors testified once more, often in their old age, determined to ensure that justice, however delayed, was not forgotten. These later trials highlighted both the persistence of memory and the failures of immediate post-war justice. They revealed how many Gestapo officials had lived quietly for decades, their pasts concealed beneath ordinary lives. Some were exposed by chance, others by the dedication of historians and survivors. Each trial reopened wounds but also reaffirmed the importance of accountability. Germany itself began to confront its past more openly, acknowledging the Gestapo's role in terror. Yet the tension between historical condemnation and legal impunity remained. The Nuremberg verdict declared the Gestapo criminal, but history revealed how easily criminals could vanish into the crowd. Justice was powerful, yet imperfectly applied. Memory carried what law could not. The legacy of Nuremberg's judgment on the Gestapo is both symbolic and cautionary. It marked a historic moment when the world declared that state terror itself could be criminal, not just individual acts. The Gestapo became a byword for tyranny, its name synonymous with fear and repression. Yet the uneven application of justice highlighted the challenges of punishing vast bureaucracies of crime. Many perpetrators escaped, shielded by politics, pragmatism, or the anonymity of their roles. Survivors were left with the bitter knowledge that while the institution was condemned, its operators often lived freely. The lessons of this reckoning echo into the present. Justice must confront not only individuals, but systems, not only leaders, but bureaucrats. Nuremberg branded the Gestapo with eternal infamy, even if its members slipped through the net. Its name endures as a warning of what happens when policing becomes terror. The trial did not end its legacy, but enshrined it. Memory, more than law, became the ultimate verdict, and that verdict was one of eternal condemnation. In the decades following the war, Germany and Europe confronted the shadow of the Gestapo with a mixture of silence, denial, and gradual remembrance. For years, many survivors struggled to have their stories heard, while society sought to move forward from the rubble. Yet over time, the need to preserve memory overcame the impulse to forget. Today, former Gestapo offices have been transformed into museums and memorials, ensuring that places of fear are not lost to history. In Berlin, the Topography of Terror Museum stands on the site of Gestapo and SS headquarters, its exhibits stark and unflinching. Visitors walk over foundations where orders of repression were once issued, now repurposed as places of education. Across Europe, former prisons and interrogation centers bear plaques and displays honoring victims. Survivors' voices, once suppressed, now resonate in audio recordings, photographs, and testimonies. The very spaces that were once instruments of fear have been reclaimed by memory. In this transformation lies a profound reversal of power. Memory has conquered terror, turning its sites into lessons for future generations. Memorials across Germany mark the physical footprint of Gestapo repression. In Cologne, the ELDEA House, once Gestapo headquarters, now serves as a memorial and museum. Its preserved prison cells covered in the graffiti of doomed prisoners. In Vienna, the Gestapo's former building has been converted into a site of remembrance, displaying records and personal stories of those detained. In Munich, the Documentation Center focuses on the machinery of Nazism, including the Gestapo's role. These sites function not only as historical archives, but as moral spaces where visitors confront the brutality of authoritarian policing. They invite reflection, not just about what happened, but about why ordinary people participated, denounced neighbors, or remained silent. By preserving these sites, Germany acknowledges responsibility rather than hiding from it. They serve as public reminders that the Gestapo was not a myth, but a reality etched into walls and records. For survivors and their descendants, these places provide recognition of suffering once ignored. For young visitors, they provide an introduction to the dangers of dictatorship. Memory is thus institutionalized in stone, glass, and silence. Scholarship has played an equally important role in reshaping how the Gestapo is understood. For decades after the war, myths persisted that the Gestapo had been omnipotent, that it had eyes and ears everywhere. Research later revealed a more complex truth. Its power often relied on ordinary citizens' denunciations, a climate of fear amplified by propaganda. Historians demonstrated that the Gestapo was formidable, not because it was omniscient, but because society enabled it through silence, compliance, and active participation. This shift in understanding changed memory from one of helplessness to one of accountability. It underscored the uncomfortable truth that terror required collaborators as well as commanders. Academic studies, survivor testimonies, and archival research have filled in the picture of how repression worked. They have shown that authoritarian policing is not sustained by a handful of monsters, but by networks of ordinary functionaries and bystanders. This lesson makes remembrance even more vital. The Gestapo is remembered not just as history, but as warning. Knowledge replaces myth and accountability replaces excuse. Public memory of the Gestapo also connects to the broader memory of the Holocaust and Nazi crimes. The Gestapo's role in deportations, surveillance of Jews, and suppression of resistance movements places it squarely within the architecture of genocide. In memorial ceremonies, survivors of Gestapo prisons stand alongside Holocaust survivors, linking personal stories to collective tragedy. Museums emphasize the Gestapo's dual function as enforcer of everyday conformity and as facilitator of extraordinary crimes. By integrating the Gestapo into Holocaust education, societies highlight how repression escalates into extermination when unchecked. This framing ensures that the Gestapo is not seen merely as a German police force, but as a symbol of how state power can be corrupted into a weapon of destruction. Memorial days across Europe echo with testimonies of those once trapped in Gestapo cells. Their remembrance affirms that policing without justice is not protection, but persecution. The Gestapo has become inseparable from the memory of the darkest chapter of the 20th century. To remember it is to confront the pathways from repression to genocide. Silence is not permitted where memory must speak. Lessons drawn from the Gestapo extend beyond the history of Nazi Germany. In the Cold War era, scholars and politicians used the memory of the Gestapo to critique secret police forces in other authoritarian regimes, from the Soviet Union's NKVD to Eastern Europe's Stasi. The comparison was imperfect, yet the warning clear unchecked surveillance breeds terror. Today, debates about state power, privacy, and human rights often return to Gestapo history as a cautionary tale. The organization exemplifies how legal systems can be twisted to criminalize dissent, how bureaucrats can become executioners, and how neighbors can be transformed into informants. Memory of the Gestapo thus serves not only as history, but as a guide for vigilance. Its lessons echo in human rights law, civil liberties debates, and ethics classrooms worldwide. It reminds societies that the line between order and oppression is dangerously thin. The Gestapo teaches that the machinery of fear is built step by step through silence, compliance, and the abandonment of conscience. Its memory insists never again. For Germany, remembering the Gestapo has been central to its democratic identity after 1945. Unlike some nations that bury their darker pasts, Germany institutionalized remembrance through education, memorials, and public dialogue. Schoolchildren learn about the Gestapo not only as an abstract organization, but through survivor testimonies and visits to memorial sites. Television documentaries, novels, and films bring stories of denunciations and interrogations to mass audiences. This active culture of remembrance reflects a commitment to confronting rather than evading responsibility. The Gestapo has thus become part of Germany's democratic DNA, a warning encoded in national identity. By remembering how easily freedoms were lost, Germany underscores the need to guard them vigilantly. Memory becomes a civic duty, not just a historical exercise. The Gestapo's crimes are recounted not to shame, but to teach. In confronting its past, Germany strengthens its present. Memory becomes not only historical record, but a defense against repetition. The story of the Gestapo thus becomes a cornerstone of democratic resilience. For survivors and their families, memory of the Gestapo remains personal as well as collective. Many carry the scars, physical, emotional, and generational, of interrogations and imprisonments. Family histories often revolve around whispered stories of arrests, betrayals, and disappearances. The act of remembrance serves as both tribute and healing. Survivor associations continue to testify in schools and public forums, ensuring that their voices are not silenced by time. For younger generations, these testimonies bridge the gap between history and lived experience. Each story anchors the vast machinery of repression in individual suffering and resilience. These voices remind us that the Gestapo was not merely a faceless institution, but a force that destroyed human lives one by one. Remembering is thus an act of justice as well as mourning. Families transform trauma into testimony, ensuring continuity of memory. The victims' stories keep history human, resisting abstraction. The Gestapo's terror lives in memory, but so does resistance and survival. In the end, the Gestapo's legacy lies not only in the horror it inflicted, but in the enduring lessons it left behind. Museums, memorials, and scholarship ensure that its crimes are documented, remembered, and confronted. Survivor testimonies give voice to suffering and resilience, transforming silence into education. The Gestapo teaches the dangers of unchecked surveillance, bureaucratic complicity, and authoritarianism disguised as order. It reveals how ordinary citizens can become enablers of repression, and how fear corrodes the bonds of community. Its memory challenges societies to guard freedom, resist authoritarianism, and uphold human dignity. In Germany and across the world, the name Gestapo has become shorthand for tyranny, but remembrance transforms that terror into warning. Memory, education, and vigilance form the true legacy. The Gestapo is remembered not to honor it, but to deny it the power of silence. In this way, memory becomes resistance and history becomes safeguard. The final lesson is clear: the past must never be forgotten, lest it return.